The banker told me my late wife's estate still held $32 million. I asked for the probate file before calling my son. The waiver inside said I had surrendered every spousal right 7 years ago. My signature was convincing. The notary seal was not. The woman who supposedly witnessed me sign had been dead for 2 months. I appreciate you being here with me today. One small thing before we start. Leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with something important only to find out they weren't who you thought? Yes or no? I read every one. Some details in this story are adapted for narrative purposes. The message behind it is what I hope stays with you. The woman across the desk had been polite 10 minutes ago. Now she locked her office door, turned the monitor away from me, and lowered the blinds halfway without explaining why. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the rain. It came down on a Tuesday night in March.
Thank you for the gift, son.
The kind of downpour that finds every weakness in a house and punishes it. I stood in my living room at 11 o'clock holding a metal bucket, watching a crack in the plaster ceiling drip brown water onto the hardwood floor I had sanded and sealed myself in 1987. The stain had been spreading for 2 years. I had watched it grow the way you watch a bruise darken, hoping it would stop on its own. My name is Vernon Caldwell. I am 73 years old, and I spent 40 years as a master cabinet maker in Caldwell County, North Carolina. I built this house with my wife Constance before our children could walk. I fitted every joint, hung every door, and laid every shingle on the roof that was now letting the sky inside. I had called my son Garrett about the roof 4 times in 2 years. Garrett is 45, a regional property development consultant, and the person who told me after Constance died that her medical bills had nearly emptied whatever she left behind. Each time I asked about money for repairs, his answer was the same. We have to make what's left last, Dad. Mom's bills took almost everything. So I collected 3 estimates from local roofers. The cheapest was $7,200. I put all 3 in a manila folder and decided to visit the trust company in the morning.
Hey, Paprika.
Not to demand anything, just to ask if I could borrow against whatever small amount remained and pay it back from my pension over 18 months. A man can measure a cabinet to a 32nd of an inch and still fail to measure the distance between trust and blindness. I had trusted my son with everything Constance left. I did not know yet what that trust had cost me. The next morning, I drove my truck to Piedmont Heritage Trust Company on Main Street in Lenore. The waiting area smelled like carpet cleaner and photocopier toner. I sat in a padded chair holding my manila folder, wearing the same flannel shirt I had worn to the hardware store the day before, and waited for someone to call my name. The woman who called it was Nadine Prescott, 44 years old, a trust account manager with reading glasses hanging on a silver chain around her neck. She shook my hand, offered me coffee from a paper cup, and led me to a small office with a window facing the parking lot. I set the folder on her desk and opened it.
Let me check.
3 estimates, 3 pieces of paper, 3 ways to say the same thing: my roof was failing and I needed help. I need $7,200, I said.
Have a look.
The cheapest estimate. I can pay it back from my pension over 18 months. Nadine took the folder and glanced at the top page. Then she asked for my social security number and typed it into her computer. I watched her eyes move across the screen the way you watch someone read a letter that was not meant for you. Her lips parted. She blinked twice. Then she did something I had never seen a banker do in 35 years of walking into banks. She locked the door. In 35 years of banking, no one had ever locked a door because of my paperwork. She came back to her chair and turned the monitor so I could not see it from my side. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. She looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering news that will rearrange every room in his life. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice had dropped low enough that I leaned forward to hear it. "Before we discuss the loan, I need to ask something." I waited. The coffee she had poured me sat untouched, black and bitter, and already going cold. "Do you know how much you own?" I almost laughed. I owned a house with a leaking roof, a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and whatever small amount Constance had managed to leave behind after the cancer took everything else. That was what I owned. That was what I had come here to borrow against. "My house," I said, "a truck, and whatever's left after my wife's medical bills." Nadine set the roofing estimates aside, as though they no longer mattered. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at me. And in that silence, I felt something shift beneath my feet, like the first crack in a foundation you thought was solid. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, "that is not what this screen says." Nadine turned the monitor toward me, and I saw my full name on the screen beside a number with more commas than anything that had ever belonged to me. $32,412,000. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because my hands had started to shake, and I thought maybe the tremor was making me see digits that were not there. But the number did not change. It sat on the screen the way a fact sits on a table, solid, immovable, and impossible to explain away.
"Hey, John."
"The Constance Caldwell Family Trust," Nadine said. She kept her voice below the hum of the air conditioning. "Created by your wife in 2009 and funded by the sale of Hale Piedmont Fine Furnishings to a national retail conglomerate. You are listed as the primary lifetime beneficiary for housing, health, and welfare." I stared at her. Constance had sold the furniture company her father built. I knew that. She had told me it would take care of us, but I had never seen a number. Garrett had handled the paperwork after she died. He told me the medical bills had swallowed most of it. He told me we had to be careful. He told me to clip coupons. "That can't be mine," I said. "I drive a truck older than some of your employees. I postponed fixing my porch for 3 years because my son said there was nothing left." Nadine did not look away. "Mr. Caldwell, you are the lifetime beneficiary of this trust. But 7 years ago, a document was filed bearing your signature. It renounces all interest in the trust and transfers administrative authority to your son, Garrett Caldwell. How does a man own $32 million and not know it? The same way he trusts his son to open the mail. The same way he thanks his boy for paying the electric bill and does not ask where the check comes from. The same way he watches the ceiling crack and believes there is no money to fix it because the one person he trusts tells him so every Sunday over coffee. I never signed anything like that," I said. Nadine pulled up a scanned image. There was my name at the bottom of a document titled Renunciation of Beneficiary Rights. The signature looked close to mine, but the V leaned too far to the right, and the tail on the last letter curled in a way I have never written in 73 years of signing my name. "That is not my signature," I said. Nadine closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, I could see she had already known. She had known before she called me in. She had known when she locked the door. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and this time her voice was barely above a whisper. "There is something else." She clicked to another screen. A court filing, dated that morning. I recognized the header, Caldwell County Superior Court. And then I recognized the name of the petitioner. Garrett Caldwell, Estate Administrator, requesting court authority to sell a residential property located at the address where I was living. My address, my house, the one I had built with Constance before our children could walk. I thought of her then. I thought of how she used her first dividend check from the furniture company to pay off our mortgage, and called it the safest investment we would ever make. She had poured that money into the walls and the foundation and the roof because she believed that a house you own outright is the one thing nobody can take from you. Now our son was selling it. The filing cites outstanding obligations against the estate.
Nadine said carefully.
It was submitted this morning. This morning.
I clicked on the link and it's working for me.
The same morning I had driven here with 3 roofing estimates in a manila folder. The same morning I had asked to borrow $7,000 from a trust worth $32 million. The same morning my son had walked into a courthouse and asked a judge to sell the house I built with my own hands. "Do you have an attorney?" Nadine asked. I did not answer.
Oh, the overlay thing's not
I
working.
sat in the chair, holding the manila folder with 3 estimates. The cheapest was $7,200.
I don't know how to fix
While
that.
the screen beside me glowed with a fortune I had never been told existed. The paper cup of coffee she had poured me sat untouched, cold and bitter. My canvas work jacket still smelled like sawdust from the workshop behind my house. The house my son was trying to sell. Nadine watched me the way people watch someone standing too close to the edge of something. She did not rush me. She did not offer advice. She sat very still and let me understand, one breath at a time, that my son had built his case around my life while I thanked him for keeping the lights on. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine idling and the rain coming down. My first instinct was to call Garrett. That instinct embarrassed me more than anything on Nadine's screen. Even now, even after what I had just learned, the reflex was to reach for the person who had trained me to reach for him. I put the phone on the dashboard and let the rain fill the silence instead. 7 years. I traced them backward through a fogged windshield while the trust company entrance blurred behind the water. Constance's funeral had been on a Tuesday in March. Same month, same kind of rain. Garrett had stood beside me at the graveside and said the words every grieving husband wants to hear from his son. "Don't worry about bills, Dad. I'll handle everything until you're back on your feet." I had been grateful. That is the part that sits heaviest now. I was grateful. He started with the mail, redirected the paper statements to his own address so I would not be overwhelmed by numbers during a difficult time.
Hey, Looney Lou.
Then the online accounts. He changed the passwords and told me the banking websites were full of scams and I should let him manage everything from his office.
Flats
I believed him
above the
because he
shops.
was my son,
I think people just
and
live
because
in these
I was
flats.
73 years old and tired in a
buildings
way
above
that had
the
nothing to
shops,
do
yeah.
with sleep. Every time I needed something, a new water heater when the old one flooded the basement, lumber for the back porch, the roof that had been leaking for 2 years.
Hey, Lisbon.
Garrett explained
JJ
with
Lisbon,
patient
hello.
regret that the money was gone. Medical bills, he said. End-of-life care. The cost of dying in America. He never called my monthly pension an allowance, but that was what it became. He decided what I could spend and when, and I let him because I thought he was protecting me. A man can spend his life teaching his children honesty and still fail to check whether they learned it. Constance had warned me once, years before she got sick. We were sitting on the back porch and she said it the way she said everything important, quietly, without looking up from her hands. Make sure the children don't let money turn them into strangers. I had thought she was talking about Lorelei, our daughter, who had stopped calling. I had not considered that the stranger might be the one who called every Sunday.
What does emergency
The
bus
phone
diversion
buzzed on
mean?
the dashboard.
I don't know. to be
Garrett's
honest.
name filled the screen. I picked it
Maybe
up
there's a
because
problem
not
with the
picking
bus
up
route.
would tell him more than answering. "Dad, where are you?" His voice was bright, casual. The
Maybe there's a
practiced warmth of
blockage
a
in the bus route, so they
45-year-old
have to
man in a
divert the
Navy
buses
sport
around
coat
different
who had
roads.
learned that patience could look identical to love. I stopped by, and
That's
your
my
truck's gone.
guess.
I had errands, I said. What errands
Hey,
in this
Stringer.
weather? Hardware store. Light bulbs. There was a pause. I had heard that pause 1,000 times before and thought it was patience. Sitting in that parking lot with the rain drumming on the roof and the vinyl seat cold against my back,
Still a super
I finally heard what it
female.
really was. Calculation. For all that time, I had mistaken silence for patience. I had mistaken control for care. I had mistaken a locked door for a
Can I go
sheltering
around here?
arm.
Yes, I can.
Dad,
That's what I'm gonna do.
I've been thinking, Garrett said,
Save the time.
his tone softening the way it always did before a suggestion that was not a suggestion. There's a really nice senior community over in Burt County. Beautiful place. Just until things are sorted out with the house. I could have you moved in by the weekend. I'm not moving anywhere, I said.
Hey, Ron, baby.
Another pause. Longer. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register I had never heard from him before. Low.
We're entering
Controlled.
the borough of Westminster.
Proprietary.
Now.
Like a man discussing an asset
We just
that was
crossed the
not
borough
performing
boundary.
as expected. Which bank did you go to, Dad? The question landed like a hand on my chest. He did not ask if I was feeling all right. He did not ask if I needed help with the light bulbs. He asked which bank, because he already knew that the only thing that would bring me to a financial office was the one thing he had spent years making sure I would never find. I hung up without answering. My hand trembled against the steering wheel. I hated that. I held it there until the shaking stopped, watching the rain streak down the windshield and trying to remember the name of the only lawyer I could think of. I had not spoken to him since Constance's funeral. Garrett had told me Sterling Ashford didn't want to hear from us anymore. But Garrett had told me a lot of things, and the list of ones that were true was getting shorter by the hour. The stairs above the pharmacy on Main Street creaked the same way they had 20 years ago. But the man who answered the door looked as though he had been waiting for a ghost. Sterling Ashford was 71 years old, an elder law attorney with steel gray hair and a small office that smelled of old paper and brass polish. He had helped Constance and me draft our first will before our children started school. He had been at the funeral, and then, according to everything I believed all that time, he had walked away from us without explanation.
Hey, Nicky,
Vernon,
Vertigo,
he said. He did not move from the doorway. His hand gripped the frame as though the building might shift. Vernon, where have you been? In your doorway, I said, wondering why you abandoned me. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. I didn't, he said.
Thanks,
Come
James.
Inside, please. He poured
Thank
me
you for
coffee
keeping
from
the
a
chat
machine in the
active
corner.
with your
Black,
chat messages.
bitter. Too strong, and sat behind a desk cluttered
you
with
so
files
much.
and a brass lamp that had been there since the first time Constance brought me to this office. Then he told me what had happened 7 years ago, 3 weeks after the funeral. Garrett sent Sterling a letter on what appeared to be my stationery. It terminated Sterling's services and stated that I wanted no further contact with him or his firm. Sterling was hurt, but respected what he believed was a grieving man's wish. He tried anyway. He visited the house twice. The first time. Garrett met him at the door and said I was sleeping. The second time, Garrett said I was staying at his place in Blowing Rock after a fall. I wrote 3 letters after that, Sterling said. All 3 came back stamped recipient declines. I should have tried harder. I should have driven up to the house and knocked until you opened the door yourself. That is something I will carry. I never saw those letters, I said. I never declined anything. I never wrote you a termination letter.
Try weather.
I thought you left because you did not want to be involved. Another person I had blamed for disappearing had been pushed away in my name. Garrett had not just stolen money. He had pruned every branch that might have held me upright. The attorney, the trust officer, and I was beginning to understand, my own daughter. He had isolated me the way you isolate a tree before you cut it down. Remove everything around it first, so there is nothing to catch it when it falls. Sterling set down his cup. Tell me everything, he said. I told him about the leaking roof, about the estimates in the manila folder, about Nadine turning the monitor toward me and showing me a number I still could not say aloud, about the renunciation document with a signature that was not mine, about the petition to sell my house filed that same morning, about the phone call in the parking lot and the question that ended it. Sterling listened without interrupting. When I finished, he stood and walked to a fireproof cabinet in the corner of his office. He pulled a key from his desk drawer, fitted into the lock, and turned it. The click echoed off the old plaster walls. I helped Constance draft the trust, he said, lifting out a thick blue binder. I did not know the furniture company shares had grown to be worth what you described. But I know what she put in this document, because she insisted on every word. Seeing Constance's full name stamped across that binder in gold letters made my throat close. She had been gone all these years, but her handwriting was still fighting for me. She had sat in this same office and dictated provisions to protect a future she would never see. And she had done it with the precision of a woman who trusted love, but did not trust luck. Sterling laid the binder on his desk and opened it carefully. turning pages until he reached a section near the back. He pointed to a clause circled in Constance's own hand blue ink, the same pen she used for everything important. Any renunciation of beneficiary rights, he read aloud, requires two independent witnesses signing in the physical presence of the beneficiary. He looked up at me. The document your son filed has one witness, a notary.
3-2.
He paused. And that notary's name is one I need to verify, because something about it doesn't sit right. I gripped the arm of the leather chair and felt. For the first time since Nadine had locked her office door, something that was not fear or fury. It was smaller than hope, but built from the same material. Constance had known. Not what would happen, but what could. And she had left a tripwire in the fine print, waiting for the day someone stepped on it. Sterling asked me to come back the next morning so he could review the full trust document overnight. I drove home in the dark, did not sleep, and was back on his stairs before the pharmacy below had unlocked its doors. He had the blue binder open on his desk, pages marked with colored tabs. He had been working since before dawn. I could tell by the coffee 3 cups lined up beside the lamp, each one darker than the last. "Sit down," he said.
Hey,
"I need to walk you through what Constance built." He started with the structure. The trust held everything from the sale of Hale Piedmont Fine Furnishings, the furniture company Constance's family had run for 3 generations. I was the sole lifetime beneficiary. Housing, health, welfare, everything I needed was supposed to come from this trust for the rest of my life, after me. Whatever remained would divide equally between Garrett and Laura.
Will I watch the England match tomorrow?
I
Is
said.
the Pope a Catholic?
The word
There's a
caught
bear
in my
shit in the
throat.
woods.
Garrett
Anonymous.
told me Constance left Lorelei
Again?
almost nothing.
What the hell?
He said
Thank
it was
you for the
because of
5
what she
pixels.
did. Sterling
Thank you,
looked at me
Anonymous.
over his glasses.
Muchos
That is not what this
gracias.
document says.
Thank you, thank
The
you, thank
split is
you.
50-50, contingent on
Thank you,
neither
thank you.
child acting in bad faith. He flipped to a second page and tapped a clause underlined in Constance's careful hand, the same blue ink from the day before. "This is the provision she fought hardest for," he said. She told me she had seen what money did to her father's family. Cousins who stopped speaking. An uncle who forged a deed. She wanted your voice sought first, loudly and in person. The clause required 2 independent witnesses present with me in person before any document could alter my rights. Not by proxy, not by phone, not by a single notary in an empty room. And then Sterling read the sentence beneath it. If either child concealed material information or acted in bad faith. Constance's clause treats them as having predeceased you. They inherit nothing. She had written the forfeiture clause 7 years before it would be needed. Constance always built things to last. Furniture, marriages, and apparently legal safeguards against her own son. She had not known which child might fail the test. She had simply made sure the test existed. Sterling set the binder aside and pulled a second document from a separate folder. A certified copy of the renunciation that had stripped away my rights. He slid it across the desk and handed me a magnifying glass. "Look at the signature," he said. I looked. The name was mine. The handwriting was not. The V leaned too far to the
Hey,
right.
Farrell.
I have written
Hey,
my
Plasma.
name the same way for 60 years, and the V always stands straight. The way I was taught in school. The flourish on the final letter curled inward instead of trailing off. And the pressure was wrong too, even across every stroke, as though someone had traced it slowly from a model rather than signing with the automatic rhythm of a hand that has written the same word 10,000 times. "The V is wrong," I said. "This isn't mine." Sterling held the page under his brass desk lamp, tilting it so the light raked across the ink at an angle. "The pressure is too uniform," he said. "A natural signature has variation heavier at the start, lighter at the tail. This looks traced." I checked the date. March 24, 2017. 10 days after Constance's funeral. 10 days. I remembered that week the way you remember a fever in fragments. Through glass. I could not open an envelope with both our names on it, without losing the rest of the afternoon. I ate what the neighbors brought and could not taste any of it. I sat in the kitchen at 3 in the morning because the bedroom still smelled like her lotion. And someone, during that week, had put a pen in my hand. Or pretended to. "I don't remember signing this," I whispered. "I don't remember being conscious enough to sign anything that week." Sterling set down his glasses. He folded his hands on the desk the way he did when he was about to say something he had measured twice before cutting. "The notary who witnessed this," he said, very quietly. "I checked the state registry while you were driving here yesterday. His license was surrendered." He paused. "Vernon, I need to find out why. Because a surrendered license and a traced signature on the same document is not an accident. It is a pattern." The coffee he had poured me sat untouched, black and cold. I could not swallow. But for the first time in 2 days, I was not drowning. I was angry. And anger, I was learning, floats better than grief. Sterling typed the notary's name into the state registry at 8:15 the next morning. And by 8:22, we knew why the license had been surrendered. I had arrived early again, before the pharmacy downstairs opened, carrying 2 coffees from the gas station because Sterling's machine had run dry the day before. He took the cup without looking up from his screen. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the careful precision of a man who had learned to type on a manual and never fully trusted the electronic kind. "Commission expired," he said, reading aloud. "No renewal filed. Office address listed as permanently closed since 2016. Could he have retired? I asked. A notary who retires usually lets the commission lapse at the end of its term. This one was surrendered mid-cycle. He clicked to another page. "Let me check one more thing." I sat in the leather chair and listened to the wall clock tick while Sterling searched. The office smelled like old carpet and printer toner and the kind of morning that has not yet decided what it is going to become. I had not eaten since the day before. My mouth tasted like paper and gas station coffee, and my stomach had stopped asking for food sometime around midnight. Sterling went still. His hand stopped on the mouse. He did not turn around immediately, and the pause told me more than the words that followed. "Vernon," he said, "I found an obituary." He turned the monitor so I could see it. A short notice from the Caldwell County Tribune, dated February 2017. Harold Emery, age 68, retired notary public, died January 14th after a brief illness. Survived by a sister in Morganton. No children. Private burial.
Hey, Maria.
January 14th. 2 months before the renunciation was dated. The man whose seal was supposed to guarantee my consent was already in the ground when someone pressed his stamp into the ink and marked it beside a signature that was not mine. I sat with that fact the way you sit with a blow to the chest, not moving, not speaking, just letting the pressure settle until you can breathe around it. "Print that," I said. Sterling hit the button, and the printer behind him hummed to life. The page came out warm. I held it between my fingers and read it again, as though the date might change on a second reading. It did not. Sterling pulled the certified copy of the renunciation from his folder and laid it on the desk beside the obituary. He circled both dates in red pen. January 14, 2017, on the obituary. March 24, 2017, on the forged document, and drew a line connecting them. 2 months, he said. Harold Emery died on January 14th. The renunciation document bearing his notary seal is dated March 24th. A dead man did not witness your signature. Then whoever made this document knew he was dead, I said. Sterling nodded slowly.
I'd rather have...
And chose him precisely because he could never contradict it. A living notary can be subpoenaed. A living notary can be asked whether he was present, whether the signer appeared willing, whether anyone else was in the room. Harold Emery cannot answer any of those questions. That is not a coincidence. That is selection. Who chooses a dead man as a witness? Someone who needs a name that will never speak, a seal that will never be questioned, and a grave that keeps every secret. Someone who understood that the only safe accomplice is one who is already beyond reach. Sterling laid both pages side by side and pressed his palms flat on the desk as though steadying himself against the weight of what we had found. "This is not an administrative mistake," he said. "This is not a filing error or a clerical oversight. This is forgery with intent. Someone obtained Harold Emery's notary seal after his death, stamped it onto a document bearing a traced signature, and filed it with a trust company to strip you of $32 million. That is a crime, Vernon. Multiple crimes." I pressed my thumb against the embossed seal on the renunciation copy. It was raised, official. The kind of mark that makes a document look real to anyone who does not check the name behind it. Harold Emery had been a good notary. He had notarized the original trust for Constance, and now his name was being used to destroy the very thing he had helped create. Sterling stood and reached for his jacket on the back of his chair. "We take this to the courthouse this afternoon," he said. Then he stopped and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not caution, not sympathy, but the focused gravity of a man who understands that knowing is only half the fight. "But Vernon, someone had to physically stamp that seal after Harold died. That means there is a second person involved, and we need to find out who before they find out about us." We did not wait. Sterling gathered the evidence into a filing packet on the drive across town. And by 2 o'clock that afternoon, we were walking through the front doors of the Caldwell County Courthouse with the obituary, the forged renunciation, and a side-by-side signature comparison tucked into a manila envelope that felt heavier than paper should. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old decisions. Fluorescent lights buzzed above the marble corridor, and our footsteps echoed off the paneling, as though the building wanted to remind us that everything set inside its walls became permanent. Sterling approached the clerk's window and slid the packet through. Doris Whitfield, a gray-haired filing clerk who had been processing motions in this courthouse since before I retired, took the envelope without comment. She opened it, checked the pages against a list on her screen, and reached for her stamp. "Emergency motion to stay the pending sale of real property held in trust," Sterling said, "on grounds of forged instrument. Exhibits A through D attached." Doris stamped the first page. The thud of ink on paper echoed off the marble walls like a small, decisive heartbeat. She stamped the second page, then the third.
Yeah, it's going okay.
She wrote a docket number in the margin, initialed it, and slid the filed copy back through the window. "Filed and received," she said. "Case number will be assigned by end of day." I stood behind Sterling and watched my son's name appear on the respondent line of a court document. Garrett Caldwell, typed in black ink on a form that would be entered into the public record of Caldwell County. I had built furniture for 40 years, measured twice, cut once. Now I was filing papers against my own son. And there was no way to measure this cut before making it. "His name is right there," I said quietly. "My boy's name in a court filing." Sterling looked at me without flinching. "He put yours on a forged document first." We took the filed copy and walked to a wooden bench in the corridor. Sterling sat beside me and explained what would happen next. The motion created an immediate stay. No one could sell the house until a judge ruled.
Thanks for just cutting
The
me off for
emergency
no
hearing
reason
would be
at all.
scheduled within 10 days. During that window, Garrett's petition was frozen. "The stay is immediate," Sterling said. "No one can sell that house until the judge rules. But the hearing will be set within 10 days, and we need to be ready." 10 days to undo 7 years, I said. 10 days to prove the 7 years were built on a lie.
Baby.
I pressed my palms against the smooth wood of the bench and felt the grain under my fingers, the way I always do when I need to steady myself. 10 days. What do you do with 10 days when the other side has had 7 years to hide everything they have done? You move. You move faster than they can clean. And you do not stop to ask permission. Sterling leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "There is a cost to this,"
Change of scenery
he
is good,
said.
yeah.
The moment Garrett is served with this motion, he will know you found the notary. He will know you found me. And whoever helped him, whoever physically stamped that seal, will start destroying evidence. We have to move faster than they clean. Then we move, I said. Sterling nodded. We stood and walked toward the exit.
Stupid cyclist, right?
The afternoon light came through the tall courthouse windows and long columns, catching dust motes that floated in the air like the last quiet seconds before a storm. We were halfway down the courthouse steps when Sterling's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, read the screen, and stopped walking. His foot hovered above the next step, as though the ground had shifted. "Vernon," he said, not looking up from the screen. "What is it?" I asked Nadine to send me a copy of Garrett's original petition, the one to sell your house. She just forwarded it. He scrolled down,
I'm still wearing t-shirt and shorts.
and I watched his expression tighten. He filed it 3 weeks ago, before you walked into the trust company, before you knew anything. He turned the phone so I could see. Attached to Garrett's petition were 4 photographs of my roof taken from above, from an angle I had never seen, showing sagging joists, water-stained insulation, and a hole open to the sky. The filing described them as evidence of structural failure requiring immediate sale. I looked at those photographs and felt something shift inside my chest, like a beam settling under too much weight. "I built that roof," I said. "I replaced every joist on the back slope myself 5 years ago. There is no hole in that roof." Sterling looked at me. I looked at the photographs, and we both understood at the same time that the evidence in Garrett's petition had been manufactured before I ever knew I needed to fight. The knock came at 7 the next morning, before I had finished my coffee, and the young man on my porch would not look me in the eye. He was barely 25. A process server named Dale Fenton in a wrinkled polo shirt, and he held the envelope out the way someone holds a thing they want to be rid of. "Vernon Caldwell," he said. "You've been served."
Me first, me first.
He was already walking back to his car before the envelope was fully in my hand. I carried it inside and sat at the kitchen table. The coffee I had poured was still steaming. The sawdust smell from the workshop drifted through the back screen door the way it does every morning. And for a moment, the house felt the way it always had. Quiet, steady, mine. Then I opened the envelope. The petition was formal. Garrett Caldwell, estate administrator, requesting court authority to sell the residential property at my address on grounds of structural deterioration and the owner's inability to maintain safe habitation.
Most people really shouldn't.
Behind the petition were 4 glossy photographs. 100% agree. I spread them across the table and studied each one. They showed my roof from above, sagging joists, water-stained insulation peeling away from the decking, and a hole open to the sky where the back slope meets the gable. The images were sharp, professional, taken from a drone angle directly above the rear of the house. I knew my roof the way I know my own hands. I had replaced every joist on that back slope in 2019.
You don't get why they
purchased the lumber from the yard on Highway 321, and still had the receipt in my filing cabinet. There was no hole, there was no sag, and no inspector had visited my property in the last 5 years. I have built cabinets that will outlast the houses they sit in. My son was building a case out of photographs of damage that does not exist, and it was better carpentry than anything I taught him. He had measured the angles, framed the shot, and assembled a false structure so convincing that any judge who did not climb onto my roof would have no reason to doubt it. I turned one of the photographs over. Printed in small type on the back was a metadata stamp. February 2024. Nobody came to my house in February with a drone. I would have heard it. I would have seen it. Which meant these photographs were taken without my knowledge, from a height that required equipment and planning, and filed with a court, weeks before I walked into Nadine's office.
Where do people
This was
get their
not a
licenses?
reaction
From the
to my
fucking Mickey
discovery.
Mouse store?
This was the plan. My discovery had interrupted it. I set the photographs aside and pulled the remaining pages from the envelope.
If you're all the same person.
Behind the petition and the photos
You might
was a
not all be
second
the same
document.
person.
A pre-admission contract for a place called Laurel Ridge Senior Living, described in a glossy brochure as a luxury residential facility in Burke County. 40 minutes from Lenore, the contract was already signed. Not by me. By Garrett as trust administrator, committing to 3 months of prepaid residency at $14,400 per month from my trust. For a room I had never agreed to, in a facility I had never heard of, on a date that stopped my breath. The move-in date was March 19th, the day after the emergency hearing.
Kind of feel like
he had already
for
picked the room,
but it doesn't flipping open
Suite
until
204.
11 a.m.
He had
the other
already
one
picked the
opens at
date.
10 a.m., but we've gone past
He had
that.
already paid for it
King's
with
Cross
money
one.
that was supposed to be mine. The hearing was not meant to determine anything. It was meant to confirm what Garrett had already arranged: my removal from my own house. My placement
Driving
in a
standards got
facility
worse.
I
Really?
did not choose.
During
And
the
the sale
COVID.
of the home I built with Constance before our children could walk. This was never about
But-
my roof. The roof was a
Yeah,
prop.
yes, I do think you're
The
right.
photographs were a stage set. The petition was a script. And the nursing home was the final scene. The one where I disappear quietly and my son collects whatever is left. I turned to the last page of the contract, looking for Garrett's signature on the authorization.
Cinnamon oatmeal with almond
It was
milk.
there. But
That
above it,
sounds nice.
on the co-signer line, was a different name. Simone Caldwell Garrett's
I've been
42-year-old
percolating
wife,
my mocha pot
who owned
too
a home
fast
staging company,
and
and who I had
extracting
last
the
seen at Christmas
coffee
pouring
too
me a
quickly.
second glass of wine and asking about my health. Beside her signature was a line item I had to read twice. Property staging consultation fee
I need to start taking my time again. It makes a
$8,500,
difference.
payable upon resident admission.
It definitely makes a
She
difference.
was not just helping him.
Am I gonna
She was
watch
not
match
just
tonight?
aware.
Absolutely, definitely,
She had
probably.
invoiced for it.
Maybe.
She had turned my eviction into a
I mean,
billable
tomorrow I'm
service.
definitely going to watch it. Tonight I'll
And the
probably
bill would
watch
be
it,
paid from the trust that bore
I'm going to
my
watch it
dead
again
wife's
tomorrow
name.
for sure.
I called Sterling before the process server's car had reached the end of my street. He told me not to touch anything and that he would be at the house within the hour. I did not wait. I dragged the extension ladder out of the workshop and leaned it against the east gable before his car had finished parking in the driveway. "I'm going up," I said. Sterling stood in the yard with his phone ready while I
You hope we
climbed.
keep it. Keep what?
The ladder rungs creaked under my weight the way they always do. I am 73 and I weigh what I have weighed since I was 50. And the ladder knows me. The roof knew me too. I had walked this ridgeline dozens of times since the last re-shingling, checking flashing after storms, clearing
I'm gonna have
leaves
to
from the
stop and
valleys.
rechat properly and
I
thoroughly
knew every
to make
scene.
sense of what you're saying.
The section from the photographs was on the back
finding it
slope,
difficult at the moment.
facing the tree line where no neighbor could see. I knelt on the gritty surface and looked at what they had done. The damage was real. That was the first thing I understood. Someone had not fabricated the photographs from another house or digitally altered the images. Someone had come to my property, climbed onto my roof, and
I
made
think
the
Spain
damage
might win
happen.
tonight.
The torn shingles had
I've got a
clean
feeling.
edges, straight lines where
Everyone
a utility
thinks France
knife
is
had
gonna
cut
win the
through
World
the
Cup.
composite.
Spain are a
Not
really
curled
good
from
team, so
age, not lifted by wind.
Who knows,
cut.
man? Who knows?
Beneath them, the exposed
3-2-3-1.
plywood showed bright yellow wood, unseasoned, fresh as the day it was milled. If this damage
Not
had been
knowing how
here
to
for
make a good pot
months,
of coffee is forgivable.
the wood would have
Yeah.
grayed.
I
It
mean,
would
I
have
do know how
swelled
to
for
do it. It
moisture.
just takes
This was
a bit
new.
longer than rushing
This
it,
shingle
right?
wasn't torn by
So-
wind, I called down.
And
The
I'm just
tear
too
line is
lazy in the
straight.
morning.
Somebody cut this with a
Just
utility
wanna do it as
knife.
quickly as possible.
Can you tell when it was done? Sterling asked from below. The wood
Too
underneath
impatient,
is
not
still
lazy.
yellow.
That's the word.
This was opened up within the last month. I have spent my life joining wood so tightly you cannot see the seam. Whoever did this had the opposite skill. They knew exactly where to pry a house apart so the damage would photograph well. They knew which section to target the back slope. Invisible from the road, impossible to check without a ladder. They had come to my house while I slept, or while I was out buying groceries or sitting in my
France,
kitchen
Belgium final.
trusting
That'd
my
be
son.
boring, though.
And they had
France
taken a
would
blade
easily
and a
beat
pry bar
Belgium.
to the house I built with my
Belgium's
own
team,
hands.
I'm going to be honest.
I moved along the
Lukaku's
fascia
past
board,
it.
running my thumb across the wood.
Let's just be honest.
There they were, pry marks, uniform, evenly spaced, each one the
What's
width
the
of
other
a
guy
half-inch
doing?
flat
The blonde
bar.
one. Quite
Someone
remember
had
his
levered the
name.
plywood away from the joists to
He's a bit
create
past
the
it as well,
sagging
to be honest.
effect
I
in the
just think
photographs.
the
The marks were
Belgian team's
identical,
not that strong,
every
as they
one
used
at
to
the
be.
same angle. which told me the person who did it was not a roofer. A roofer would have varied the pressure. This was someone following instructions. Sterling, I said, come up to the third rung and photograph the fascia. He climbed halfway up and held his phone steady while I pointed to each mark. The camera clicked in the quiet afternoon, and the birds in the backwoods went on singing as though nothing in the world had changed. Let me tell you what it feels like to stand on your own roof and realize that someone came to your home while you were inside it and took a pry bar to the house you built with your hands. It does not feel like anger. Anger is loud. This was quieter than that. It was the sound of something I had trusted falling away, like a joist giving up its nails one at a time. This is manufactured evidence attached to a court filing, Sterling said, scrolling through the photographs on his phone. That is a separate crime from the forgery, a separate fraud. Someone came to your house, damaged your roof, photographed it from the air, and filed it as proof you cannot maintain your property. This was prepared before you knew anything was wrong. He kept scrolling and then stopped. He expanded one of the photographs, not the roof shots,
Sugar daddy.
but one he had taken of the ground beside where the ladder stood.
Thank you, sugar daddy.
Vernon, look at this.
I don't know if
I climbed down and stood beside him.
That's what I'm gonna call
On
them,
his
so
screen, clear in the damp
they
earth
like it, if
below
they
the back
continue to,
gable, were boot prints,
gift stuff.
deep ones,
If they don't,
pressed
I'll
into the
stop
mud by
calling them
someone
that.
standing in one place long enough to do work above. And beside them, tire tracks. 2 narrow ruts leading from the tree line to the base of the
Thank you,
house
Anon, thank you.
and back again.
For the 20
The tread
gift
pattern
subs,
was slim,
That's incredible.
the kind you
Thank
see
you.
on a compact luxury vehicle.
That is
Simone
incredible.
drives a small Mercedes, I said. Sterling nodded slowly and took 3 more photographs of the mud before the afternoon light faded. The evening light was fading through Sterling's office window when he sent the mud photographs to his laptop and
Yeah, but it's every
enlarged them
4
until the
years.
tire treads filled the
That's
screen.
fine. I'm not
Narrow
against that, to be
profile,
honest.
European
Like, I think
spacing,
FIFA's
consistent
a load
with a
of shit,
compact
but
luxury vehicle.
having more teams in the World
We
Cup,
did not
I
say
don't think that's a
Simone's
bad
name
thing.
again.
Obviously,
We
it's
did
a
not
money
need
grab,
to.
but it is
The
called
tracks
the World
said
Cup
it for
after
us.
all. It's not
The
called
next afternoon,
48 teams in the world.
Nadine called.
Cup.
She had told me when we first met that she would reach out
Hello,
only
extremely
if
subtle.
something changed. So when her number appeared on my phone at 2 o'clock on a quiet Wednesday,
I don't know what
I knew
to do
something
now.
changed. I drove to the trust company and
cycled to
found her
central
waiting in
London.
the same
Now
office
what?
where this had all begun.
More excessive,
The blinds still
more
half
existential
drawn,
crisis
a transaction
Hey,
folder
Kiwi,
open
why?
on her desk. I pulled the full acquisition ledger for the
Look at the
last
dog
3
banter.
years, she said. She did not waste time on greetings. Your son approved a land purchase 6 months
Slushy,
ago.
this early in the morning? Nah.
14 acres of commercial
They won't
property
even sell it
outside
this early in the
Lemoore.
morning. They haven't turned the machine
The
on
trust
yet.
paid $2.1
It'll still be
million.
liquid.
She turned the folder toward me and pointed to the county assessment line. $980,000. The trust had paid more than double the assessed value. Who approved it? I asked. Your son,
115.
as
thank you for the
administrator.
gift. Sub
He has
to
sole signature authority on
Oi.
acquisitions under $5 million.
Oi.
There was no independent
Wow.
appraisal on
Thank you.
file, no competitive bid,
Movad VPN.
no
You've not seen these
third-party
massive adverts.
review.
Look at that.
$2.1
There's one
million.
there. The whole of that is covered with Movad.
For land the county
And
said
then
was worth
this one
less
up
than
here
$1
is
million.
covered with Movad as well.
And the difference over $1 million of my trust went somewhere. I gripped the
1984
edge
was
of
supposed to be a
Nadine's
warning, not
desk
an
and waited
instruction
for her to
manual.
tell me where.
Oh, that's
The
what it
selling
says.
entity is Foothills Property Solutions,
That's what I
LLC,
read.
she said. She pulled a state business filing from the folder and set
Go
it
to
in front of
Soho
me.
Square, maybe,
I
or
pulled
get
the
a coffee.
registration.
I need something to eat. I've
Vernon
already had a
Et.
coffee at home.
It's registered to Simone Caldwell, my daughter-in-law's company. The same woman whose staging fee appeared on the nursing home contract. The same woman whose tire tracks we had photographed in the mud below my sabotaged roof. She had sold a piece of land to my trust at twice its value,
because
pocketed the
this ad here
difference,
has
and
changed
her husband had
over the
signed a
last
check. Nadine
few
spread a
weeks.
parcel
Every-
map
every
across her
week or so
desk
they
and
keep
pointed
changing
to
it.
the property. The address was on the old highway east of town,
Muskrat,
past
thank
the
you for
rail
the
crossing,
sub.
near where the
Muskrat Jack,
furniture
thank you.
mills used to stand
Thank you,
before they
thank you.
closed one by one through the 80s and 90s. I knew the address before she finished pointing. I know
You
this
still
land.
miss the arcade games in the
I said.
Trocadero. I vaguely remember that.
My voice came out
I
quieter
vaguely
than I
remember
intended.
those games.
This is where Constance's father started. The old Hale Piedmont factory. They sold it
Their
when the
food and
company
drinks
was
are so
liquidated
good. I was
to
reading
fund
the
the
London
trust.
Food subreddit
Nadine
recently, and they were
nodded.
saying that Soho
She had
has
already
gone
made
really
the connection.
downhill in terms of food.
Constance's
And the
father,
place for like medium
Raymond
to high-end
Hale, had
food
poured the
nowadays is
concrete
Mayfair.
foundation of that workshop with his
Obviously,
own
nowhere's
hands
gonna
in
do low-end food in
1961.
central London
He
at
built the
reasonable
first
price, so you
workbench
can,
from
like,
white oak he
if you're
milled
trying to
himself.
eat out in central London,
Constance
you're
used
gonna
to
be
take the
looking at
children
the
there
medium
every
to
summer
high-end food
to see
options.
where the family business
Or you're just looking
began.
at like
She would walk them
Greggs
through the
and
empty
fucking Slim
factory
Chickens and
floor
shit.
and tell them that everything worth having starts with someone willing to do the work nobody else wants to do. Now her daughter-in-law had
lot of
turned that
expenses across
foundation
that, yeah.
into a line item on a fraud. Garrett had used his dead mother's trust to buy back her father's land at an inflated price and funnel the profit to his own wife. The land that was sold to
Yeah.
create the trust was purchased again by the trust at double cost, and the surplus disappeared into a company controlled by the family that was draining it. The trust bought it back, Nadine said, at twice what it's worth, through your daughter-in-law's company. That land is where her father built his first workshop.
Is it a Spanish
I
chicken
whispered.
sandwich today? It may
Constance
be,
used
That's
to take
actually
the
a good
children
idea,
there
yeah.
every
I
summer,
mean, it's always a good idea.
and Garrett used her trust to
I don't think
overpay
I'm going
his
to go
own
back to
wife
the
for
Tottenham
it.
Court Road branch.
Nadine
of that
watched me
shop, though.
the way she had watched me on the
Last time
first
I was
day,
there, they were a bit weird
carefully,
about the camera. They
without
were just a bit
rushing,
like,
letting
they
the
were
weight
curious, but
settle
then
at
they
my
just
own pace.
didn't make the order.
Then she pulled
And I was
one more
standing around
page
for
from
like
the
10
file and
minutes,
set it in front of
and
me.
they just didn't make
It
my
was a
sandwich,
second
and I had
land
to go up and be
transaction.
like, "Where's my
Same
fucking
seller,
sandwich?"
Foothills Property Solutions. Same lack of independent
Shouldn't have
appraisal.
to do that, to be honest.
Different
Level
parcel,
6 hype
different
train, thank you.
acreage, dated 3
Thank
months
you.
before the
1.5
factory land
minutes
deal.
left of the level
Another
6 hype
above-market
train, chat.
purchase paid for with
Oh my
trust
God, this
funds
fountain
and
has a
routed
gate
through
around
Simone's
it.
company.
They put a
Vernon,
fence around this bloody thing. I've
Nadine
never
said,
seen that before.
and her voice
this is
carried
a
the
world
careful
first.
weight
Yeah.
of someone who has spent weeks assembling a picture she
I don't
hoped
think
was
I've ever
wrong.
seen
This
these
isn't one
horses
deal. There are more.
surrounded by this fence
And I think a
before.
woman named Colleen Ramsey was fired
Ever
from this company
before.
because she found them.
Ever before.
I looked at the second transaction
Wowee.
page and understood that what I had discovered was
This is
not the
content.
edge of the problem.
Do I
It
like
was the
Japanese?
surface.
I like Japanese.
Underneath it. The fraud went deeper than a forged signature and a sabotaged roof. It
Seems
went
you're
all the
back
way
on your
down to
phone
the
and money, but
foundation.
Have you found your DVD?
I drove
No.
home from the trust company
I tried
that
to get
evening
money
with
out, but I didn't
Nadine's
have any
documents on the
funds
passenger
available.
seat and Colleen Ramsey's name circling through my mind. But it was not Colleen who stopped me in the
Rice wine
kitchen
shop on
doorway.
Brewer Street that does decent
It was the
freshly
phone
made
book.
Japanese convenience
I
food.
found
Oh,
it in the
really?
bottom of the junk drawer,
Let me
wedged
see.
behind
That's a
expired
good- Thank you
coupons.
for the.
Constance's
never heard
handwriting
of that.
covered the inside cover, family numbers first. Then friends, then the church directory.
What's it called?
Halfway down the family column,
Rice wine on Brewer
an
Street.
ink that had faded but not disappeared. Lorelei, my daughter, 47 now. A community college academic counselor in Hudson,
Opens at
20
10
minutes
a.m.
up the road. She might as well
I've
have been
never
on the
noticed
other
that
side
before. I
of the
always
country
thought- I
for all the
noticed the outside. I
distance
recognize
Garrett
the
had
outside
put
of it.
between us.
I had no
After
idea
Constance
that was.
died in 2017,
I mean, it does
Garrett
say
told me
Japanese food on the
Lorelei
outside. I've just
resented
never-
the trust
never been
structure,
in there. Onigiri. Shit, they sell
blamed her
fresh
mother for
onigiri.
naming him administrator, and wanted
They sell
no
fresh
contact.
katsu curry in a
I
box.
believed him, because
Holy
I
shit,
was
that's
burying my
actually a
wife
good,
and did not have the
suggestion,
strength
thank
to
you.
question one more thing.
What time's it
7
open? In
years.
25 minutes it opens.
But Garrett had also forged my signature, sabotaged my
Golden
roof, and funneled trust money through his wife's shell company. So I picked up the phone.
Choo-choo, thank you for the hype
My
train
hands
chat.
shook.
I appreciate it. Thank you very
The
much.
kitchen was dark except for
Thank
the
you,
light
thank
over
you.
the
So
stove,
early as well.
and I could see my
So
reflection
early
in
for
the
a hype
window.
train.
An
I've not
old
even had
man
breakfast yet.
holding a phone
I'm
like it was a
half asleep
grenade.
Still, to be honest.
I dialed and
I mean,
listened to it
I'm
ring.
legally
Each ring stretched
awake
longer
enough to
than the
cycle my
last.
bike safely.
If she
in case any
hangs
law
up,
enforcement
I told myself,
watching for some
Garrett told
random
the
reason.
truth about at least one thing. If she does not, then I have
not
lost
actually
7
half
years I
asleep.
can never get back. The line clicked. A pause, then, hello. Her
Hey,
voice sounded
Pampilio.
like her mother's. That was the first thing I noticed, and it
We're
nearly
once
broke
again in
me before
central
she said a
London,
single word beyond that greeting.
contemplating
Younger,
existence
quicker,
and
but the same
breakfast.
cadence, the slight rise at the
Riffing
end of a
on
question,
the
the
World
softness
Cups.
underneath the caution.
Future
Lorelei, I said,
64 team
it's your father. Silence.
possibilities.
I heard her breathing,
riffing
then a
on
sob, sharp and sudden,
level 6
the
hype
kind that
train we
comes
just
when something
met.
held together
Got
for
to.
years finally
Thank you,
cracks.
Thank you,
Dad,
thank you.
her voice splintered on
Riffing
the
on
word.
this, riffing on that.
I called you. I called so many
had a
times.
monster and two
Garrett
puppies
said you
yesterday.
told him you didn't want to
And you
hear
feel
from
great
me.
today.
The kitchen tilted. I gripped the table edge and pressed the phone harder against my ear. He told
Police,
me you
yeah.
were the
Oh,
one who
shit,
walked
maybe
away,
it's
I
police.
said. that you resented your mother's decisions.
Oh, no.
I never said that. I never said any of that. She was crying openly now, and so was I.
I don't even have a DVD
I did not
player.
realize it until I tasted salt at the corner of my mouth. Dad. I was at the funeral. 3rd row. I sat behind the Hendersons because I came late. Garrett found me in the parking lot afterward. He said you couldn't stand to see me there, that you needed space. I never said
That's
that.
really not far.
I know
where that is.
I know that now. Imagine learning that your child spent 7 years believing you did not love her, and that the person who planted that belief sat at your kitchen table every Sunday, poured your coffee, asked about your blood pressure, and told you what a shame it was that Lorelei had cut herself off. Garrett had not just lied to me. He had lied to both of us, mirror image lies, perfectly calibrated.
Stands for opponents, doesn't
He
it?
told me she left. He told her I pushed her away. Then he stepped into the gap he created. The devoted son, sole administrator of a trust worth millions, with no one left to question what he did with it. I tried calling for 2 years.
Why am I so
Lorelei
stupid?
said quietly. Every few months, Garrett always answered.
Find it
He always had a
bizarre how
reason
the
you
legs
couldn't
up
come to
opens,
the
I know.
phone.
I mean, it's because there's
After
no
a
one
while,
here, right?
I
The demand's
stopped.
just not there.
Her
No
voice
one lives
steadied.
in central London, apart
barely.
from people that actually live here. Like, there are
7
people
years
that
I
live
thought you didn't want me. 7 years I thought that. The cedar scent from the workshop drifted through the back door I had left open.
here. But they're not
The phone book lay on the
waking up
table
before
with
10 a.m.
Constance's handwriting facing up. My daughter was alive and 20 minutes away, and she had
I mean,
never
there are
left.
people that own
Then,
property here
Before we hung
that
up,
don't live here. I
Lorelei
think
said
that's
one
much
more thing.
likely than people actually living
Dad,
here.
there's something else.
You grew up in Croydon.
Last year, Garrett
to
came
hear
to
it.
see me, the only time in 7 years. He brought a document, said it was a formality. Something about giving up my share of Mom's trust. I didn't sign it. She paused. But he had someone with him,
I don't know what I
a
should
young
get from
man
this
with a
Japanese
notary
shop.
kit.
What should I get from there?
Dad. He had the stamp
good?
ready
Have you had
before I
anything
even
from there
opened the
before?
door. I called Sterling before dawn and told him what Lorelei had said about the young man with the notary
This is
kit.
open. What's this?
He did not ask me to
Oh, it's
repeat
like a
it.
bakery.
He
Chinese
said he would
bakery.
meet me at her door by 9. The duplex sat on a quiet street near Caldwell
time?
Community College in Hudson.
I don't know.
A plastic tricycle
Chinese.
leaned against the porch
I can see
railing,
Mandarin.
and the welcome mat read, "The Caldwells." My own name on a door I had never stood behind. I knocked. And the woman who opened it looked so much like Constance
Hey,
that I
Scott.
could not speak for a full 10 seconds. Lorelei did not say hello either. She stepped forward and put her arms around me. And we
Places
stood
open
in that
and closed on these
hallway
sides.
without
Yeah,
a
one of
word,
them- one of the
while
brand new
Sterling
ones,
waited
right,
on the
yeah, I think
porch
it's-
and gave us the minute
Is it
we
this
needed.
one?
When she pulled back,
Palomar.
her
Yeah,
eyes
one of
were
these
wet,
is brand new.
but her jaw was
Speedboat
set.
bar, maybe this one?
She led us to the kitchen
remember, we saw
table,
them renovating
where a
it
shoebox
recently.
sat waiting. I
I don't
kept
think it's this
everything,
one, it might be this
she
one.
said. She opened the lid and pulled out a stack of
Looks
envelopes.
pretty new, to be honest.
Letters she had
Yeah, it
mailed
might
to
be
me,
this one.
birthday cards,
Thai
holiday
restaurant, man. They
notes.
got pictures of the
A long
Thai premium
handwritten
and
letter
Thai
dated
premium
the
there.
first anniversary of
I
Constance's
think
death.
this is a new speedboat
Every
bar.
one had been stamped "Return to Sender" in handwriting that was not mine. I held the birthday card from 2019
Yeah, what's good
and
to
studied
buy
the
from
block
this
letters on the
Japanese shop?
front. The R leaned the same way Garrett's always
Must be
had.
authentic if it's got a picture of the
Pressed
king.
too hard at the top. I never
think they
saw
have
these,
to.
I said. Not
Or
one.
maybe it's just a tradition.
Sterling picked up the envelope
I don't
and
know.
photographed the handwriting,
I think in Thailand
the
they have
postmark,
to.
and the return stamp. Then Lorelei set a printed page on the table, an email sent to her from an
Do you say
address that used
Thailand
my
or
name.
Thailand?
4 days
Thailand.
after
I
the
say
funeral,
Thailand.
telling her the family needed distance
Going to
and
Thailand.
asking her not to call
Like
again.
Spider-Man.
Have you ever
You
held a
say
letter your
Spider-Man
child
or
wrote to you?
Spider-Man.
A letter you were never allowed to read and understood that every year it went
Spider-Man.
unanswered. She believed a little more that you did not love her.
Spider-Man.
This email address was registered 4 days after the funeral, Sterling said,
He had a
adjusting
slushy on
his
Saturday
glasses
'cause of
over
me,
the
really?
printout.
What, was it good or no?
Someone created it specifically
good?
to push Lorelei away. The registration will have an IP address. That IP
Spider-Man.
will have a location. Lorelei
Spider-Man.
pulled out her phone and showed us the call
Yeah,
log
Americans
from her
say
carrier.
Spider-Man.
2 years of outgoing calls to my
Spider-Man.
number, none lasting more than 40 seconds. Garrett had answered every one. He had a reason
I think
each
that's the
time
correct
I
way
was
to say it,
resting.
Spider-Man.
I was in the workshop. I was not feeling well. After 2 years of excuses, she stopped calling. "I thought you hated me for something I couldn't name," she said. I didn't know he was the wall between us the entire time.
I'm feeling great, by
Garrett
the way.
had
I'm feeling
manufactured
really
a 7-year
energetic and
estrangement
enthused about
using
today's
forged
stream.
handwriting,
I was
a fake
definitely not on
email
the cusp
account,
of staying at home.
and intercepted phone calls. He had removed the one person who might have questioned why the trust's sole administrator was also its largest beneficiary. Sterling documented every piece of the envelopes. The email, the call records spreading them across Lorelei's kitchen table, while coffee she had poured sat untouched and the smell of cinnamon bread drifted from the oven. Then a small voice came from the hallway. "Mom?" A boy stood in the doorway, in pajamas, holding a wooden toy truck with a missing front wheel. He was 8 years old, sandy-haired, with Constance's chin and my father's ears. Lorelei's son, my grandson. Beckett Caldwell and I had not known his name until last night's phone call. 8 years old. He had been alive for 8 years, and I did not know he existed. Garrett had stolen that too. Not money this time, but something no court could put a price on. "Beckett," Lorelei said gently, "this is your grandpa, the one I told you about." The boy studied me the way children do when they are checking whether a real person matches the story. Then he walked across the kitchen and held the truck out with both hands. "Mom said you can fix anything made of wood," he said. "Can you fix this?" I took the truck.
I mean, this is for me.
The joints were hand-carved finger joints, the same technique I had taught both my children in the workshop decades ago. I turned it over. The underside of the chassis had tiny letters scratched into the wood, the way I used to sign my own pieces. It read, "For Dad when he comes back." Lorelei had carved it. She had carried my craft forward and waited.
Parmesan.
"I can
Why
fix
did they say
this,"
Parmesan
I said,
and not Parmesan?
and my voice broke on the last
Why do
word.
Americans say Parmesan?
Then Sterling's phone rang. He
What
glanced
is
at the
that?
screen, excused himself to the porch, and when he came back, his face had changed. The look he gave me over Beckett's head was one I had seen only once before the morning he told me the notary was dead. "That was the courthouse," he said.
Wait, what?
"Garrett knows." The
What do you
porch
mean,
door
Robert?
clicked as Sterling stepped back inside and closed it behind him. Beckett had gone to his room, and Lorelei sat across from
Any
me at the kitchen
predictions?
table with her
I think
hands
Spain's
wrapped
gonna
around a
win 3-2
mug that had
today,
gone cold.
and I think that England's gonna...
Sterling did not sit down.
I don't want to predict.
Garrett's
tomorrow.
attorney filed a counter motion this morning, he said. His voice carried the careful precision he used when the news was bad and the margin was thin. He's claiming you lack the mental capacity to manage your property or your finances. He wants the court to order a guardianship evaluation. Lorelei's mug hit the table. "He's trying to have Dad declared incompetent." "On what grounds?" I asked, though I already felt the shape of the answer forming. "Living alone at 73, refusing assisted living, property in visible disrepair." Sterling paused. He attached photographs, the same photographs from the house sale petition, the roof, the water damage, the porch, the same photographs of damage Garrett had caused. He had taken a pry bar to my roof in the dark, and now he was using the wreckage to argue I could not take care of myself. The man who broke my house was asking a judge to take it away because it was broken. If the court orders a guardianship evaluation, your ability to act on your own behalf gets frozen until it's resolved, Sterling said. That means you can't contest the trust administration, can't file motions, can't manage your own finances. Everything stops. How long? The hearing is in 8 days. We have to defend on 2 fronts now, the trust fraud and your competency. If he wins the guardianship motion, the fraud case dies before it starts. How do you prove you are sane to a court that has already been handed photographs of your collapsing roof, a roof your own son took a pry bar to in the dark? Every piece of evidence Garrett had manufactured to sell my house was now being repurposed to lock me inside it under someone else's authority. The staging, the damage, the nursing home contract, all of it pointed in the same direction. And from the outside, to a judge who did not know the full story, it would look like a concerned son trying to protect a declining father. Sterling stayed another 20 minutes. outlining the legal strategy. We would need medical records, a cognitive evaluation from an independent physician, testimony from people who interacted with me regularly. He would file a response by Friday. Then he gathered his notes, nodded to Lorelei, and drove back to Lenoir. The kitchen was quiet after he left. The wall clock ticked in the hallway. Lorelei poured me coffee from the pot she had made that morning, lukewarm and bitter. But I drank it because she had poured it, and because there was nothing else to do with my hands. "There's something I didn't tell you last night," she said after a while. "About Mom." She set the mug down and looked at me with Constance's eyes, the same shade of gray-green, the same way they narrowed when something mattered. "The last week, Mom told me Garrett had been asking questions about the factory land. Who owned it now? What it was assessed at? Whether the trust's charter allowed real estate acquisitions. She said he had plans for that land that didn't include you." The kitchen went very still. Outside, a school bus rumbled past on the road. "She never told me," I said. "She was going to." Lorelei's voice dropped to near a whisper. "She died on a Tuesday. She told me on the Saturday before. She said she needed to write it down first, that she wanted everything documented before she confronted Garrett. She died on a Tuesday. She had 4 days between the warning and the end. And she spent them trying to protect me from something I would not discover for 7 more years." Constance had seen it coming. She had watched her own son circling the trust like a man measuring a room for furniture that was not yet his. And she had tried to leave a record. "Mom kept notebooks about everything important," Lorelei said. "The trust, the house, the children, the business. She never threw anything away, and she never left anything unfinished. If she wrote it down, it's in your attic, Dad." I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table and understood that Constance had left me more than a trust and a house. She had left a trail, 4 days of writing in the notebook she kept in the cedar chest in the attic, the one I had not opened since the funeral. I drove home that evening with Beckett's toy truck on the passenger seat, and one question I could not stop asking. What had Constance written in those last 4 days? And had Garrett already gone looking for it? I did not go to the attic that night. Sterling called before I reached home and said Nadine had finished assembling the full transaction history. Years of records, organized into binders. She wanted us there first thing in the morning. The attic could wait. The numbers could not. Nadine had cleared the conference room at Piedmont Heritage Trust Company and locked the door before we arrived. 3 binders sat on the table, each one tabbed and highlighted, and Lorelei was already seated beside Sterling when I walked in. Nadine did not waste time. "Management fees," she said, opening the first binder. "$340,000 per year for 7 years. He approved each payment himself. The industry standard for a trust this size is $60,000. She turned the pages slowly, letting the columns speak. Year after year, the same line item administrator compensation. Authorized by the administrator. Reviewed by no one.
I don't know how many thank yous I'm supposed to say.
Sterling wrote the running total on a legal pad. When he underlined the final number, Lorelei leaned forward to read it. Nearly $2.4 million in management fees alone. Almost $2 million more than the industry standard would have paid him, Sterling said. He set down his pen. Added to the inflated land purchases through Foothills Property Solutions, we are looking at over $5 million diverted through 2 channels. Lorelei's face went pale. She gripped the edge of the table and stared at the column of numbers as though she could make them change by looking hard enough. $5 million, she said quietly. And Dad was living on a fixed budget Garrett set at $2,800 a month. $2,800 a month. That is what my son decided my life was worth, while he paid himself nearly 6 times that amount every 30 days to manage the money his mother left to protect me. I poured water from the plastic pitcher on the table and drank it. It tasted metallic and flat, but my mouth had gone too dry to speak without it. Nadine moved to the second binder, the land transactions. The factory deal I already knew about, but there were 3 more. 3 additional parcels purchased through Simone's company at above-market prices, totaling another $1.4 million. Every one lacked an independent appraisal. Every one was approved by Garrett alone. 5 transactions total, Nadine said. All routed through the same shell company, all priced well above assessed value. Sterling photographed each page with his phone, the click of the camera shutter punctuating the silence between figures. Then Nadine opened the 3rd binder. "This is the document that made everything else possible," she said. She slid a single page across the table. It was titled Diminished Capacity Assessment and dated 2022. It stated that I lacked the cognitive ability to evaluate financial instruments above $10,000. It recommended that all trust decisions be delegated to the acting administrator without requiring my informed consent. Someone wrote a document that said I could not understand my own finances, and I never knew it existed until this morning. That is what it means to be erased while you are still alive.
Do I play
Not
it
with
every
violence,
Friday?
not with cruelty anyone could see,
in the last year?
but with a single page filed quietly in a binder, reducing a 73-year-old man to a signature that was no longer required. The assessment was signed by a certified financial planner named Hugh Bartlett. "Who is this financial expert?" I said. "I have never met him. No one has ever tested my capacity for anything." Sterling took the page and studied the signature. "This is the lock he put on the door before he emptied the house.
I haven't heard that wig thing for a while.
Without this assessment, every transaction above $10,000 would have required your signature or an independent review. With it, Garrett had unchecked authority over every dollar. The assessment was never sent to Vernon," Nadine confirmed.
That was like a shotgun.
It was filed internally. I found it in the compliance archive, misfiled under a different account number. I do not believe that misfiling was accidental. Lorelei had not spoken in several minutes. She sat very still, her hands flat on the table, and when she finally looked up, her expression had hardened into something I recognized. Constance's face when she had made a decision. "Hugh Bartlett," she said. "Where is his office?" Sterling turned the assessment over. On the back, in small print, was the practice address of Financial Planning Office in Blowing Rock, on the same private lane where Garrett lived.
What was the wig thing?
"That is not a coincidence," Lorelei said. Sterling was already reaching for his phone.
But I can't exactly remember what it
"No,"
is.
he said, scrolling to a number he had saved 2 days ago. "It is a pattern." He pressed dial. I watched the name on his screen, Colleen Ramsey.
Because I always look behind
Colleen
me.
Ramsey
But I got close to
answered
her and
Sterling's
they
call
grabbed
on the second ring.
And they were pissed off.
She listened for less than a
Didn't
minute,
get them, but
then named
were-
a cafe in
to be
downtown
fair,
Lenore and said she could be
they
there
were
by
quite
2.
rightfully pissed off.
She had been waiting for this phone call. She said for the better part of a decade.
I was very close
She
to
was
them.
already
I didn't
sitting
get
in the
them, but I
back
was very
corner
close to
when we
them.
arrived. A trim woman of 52, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, facing the door. Her hands wrapped around a cup she had not touched. She had been the trust compliance officer at Piedmont Heritage before Garrett had her fired, and the careful way she watched us cross the room told me she had spent the years since then expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. Sterling made the introductions. Colleen looked at me for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something she had suspected. The commission number on the notary seal didn't match anything in the state database, she said without preamble. I ran it twice. The notary was listed as deceased license surrendered 18 months before the document was stamped. I filed an internal compliance report on a Tuesday. By the following Friday, I was cleaning out my desk. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. A couple at the window table laughed about something I could not hear. The ordinary world kept moving around us, while Colleen described how she had tried to protect me and been destroyed for it.
Well, I've lived here for
Performance
15
issues,
years now, so
she said, and the bitterness in those 2 words was years deep. That was the official reason. The severance included a non-disclosure clause covering all internal trust operations. I signed it because I had 2 children in middle school and no savings. I couldn't afford to fight.
Who's Mick Jagger
She
again?
had 2 children
Is
and
he
no
the Who
savings.
or the Rolling Stones?
And the man who
I always
drained
get
my
those two
trust
bands
was the
mixed
same
up,
man
to
who
be
took her
honest.
livelihood for noticing. Garrett
I
did
don't
not
really,
just
I've not
steal
really
money.
listened to either of those bands
He
ever in my
burned
entire life
everyone
for
who
some
stood
reason.
between
Neither of
him
my
and the
parents
next
are into
dollar.
them.
Colleen for her diligence,
I don't know
Lorelei
why,
for
I
her
never, ever
proximity,
listened to the Who
me
or the
for my
Rolling Stones.
trust. Did you keep a copy of the
One of those
compliance
ones I just
report?
never
Sterling
fucking-
asked. They
never
wiped
ever
my
listened to.
system access the day I
He
was
was in the
terminated.
Beatles.
But
No,
I had
the Beatles
already
is actually a
emailed
band
myself the commission
from
number
Birmingham.
discrepancy from my personal account. She touched her
Not the
bag
Beatles.
on the
Oh, it's
seat
from
beside
BTS.
her.
Oh, okay.
I still
Mick
have that
Jagger from
email.
BTS. Oh, the famous
I have had it
Korean.
for 7
Mick
years.
Jagger, yes, of course.
Sterling set down
How
his
could I
pen.
forget?
The hearing is in 6 days. I need to ask you directly, will you testify? Colleen did not answer immediately. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, and the cafe noise filled the silence. When she looked up, she looked at me, not
Roger
Sterling.
Daltrey.
Do you believe me?
No idea, mate.
She said.
I mean, I probably know what he looks like.
Because the
I can
last
picture
time I
him, but
told someone what I
I
found,
don't know that music.
I lost my
Never got
job
into it.
and my reputation. I was the compliance officer who got fired for doing compliance.
Never,
Nobody
ever
at
got
that
into it,
company
ever.
returned my calls afterward. Not one person in 7 years. I need to know if this will be different before I do it again. How many people had tried to help me over all that time?
Harry Styles. No, not Harry
How
Styles.
many had
Harry
seen
Styles
something
is like
wrong and been
Mick Jagger's
silenced
reincarnation,
before the
isn't
words
he?
reached me?
I think he idols
Colleen
Mick
had
Jagger.
found the discrepancy
Allegedly.
before Sterling did. Before Nadine did. Before I knew
Styles.
there was anything to find.
But
She had been
no, I
right.
don't, maybe that's why I don't.
And being right had
appreciate
cost her
Harry Styles'
everything.
Wonderful music.
7 years
I never
ago, you
listened
tried to
Mick
protect
Jagger's
me,
Wonderful music.
and they punished you for it, I said.
Is there a connection?
I believe you because everything you found is still there. They just thought nobody would ever look
Is
again.
it Friday yet?
Colleen set her cup down on the table
let me
the
check.
first time she had
Yes.
released it since we
Yes,
arrived.
it is.
Her hands were steady. The severance
It's
agreement said I couldn't
Friday,
discuss internal trust
Friday.
operations.
Why did she go to the
she
bus
said.
stop and
But
then
it
get in
didn't
a
say
car?
I couldn't testify under
That's what I
subpoena.
was thinking about those
I
lyrics last
checked.
night. I was like,
3 times in 7
gotta
years.
get down to
I
the
checked.
bus stop. Gotta
She
catch
straightened
my
in her
bus.
chair.
I see my
I'll
friends,
testify. I
and
just
then the
need
friends
someone
are
to
sitting in the
believe
front
me
seat
this
in the back
time.
seat. And she
Sterling
can't decide
reached
which seat to
across the
take, so
table and shook her
She's
hand.
waiting at the bus stop.
Then Colleen reached into
For
her
her
bag
friends
and pulled
arriving
out
in
a
a
folded
car.
printout, creased and softened from years of being stored.
Hello, Nathan Edwards.
Unfolded, read,
Welcome in.
and refolded. The
Welcome.
email she had sent herself the week
Welcome
before she
in.
was fired. One more thing, she said. The week before they terminated me, a young man came to the trust
Maybe
office
it
with
was a
Garrett.
surprise.
He carried a portable notary
Life's
kit,
full of
the kind
surprises.
freelancers use. Garrett introduced him as his
Ain't it really?
paralegal. She unfolded the
just full of
printout and
surprises.
set it on the table between us. I wrote his name down because
There's all
something
this
about
stuff
the
on
visit
floor.
didn't feel
This
right.
car wanna go?
The name on the email, highlighted in yellow ink that had faded but not disappeared, was Paxton Riddle. Paxton Riddle. Sterling ran the name that night and
Why did
found him a
that car completely
34-year-old
miss the light?
freelance paralegal operating
fuck?
out of Hickory, whose notary commission had been
Why
active
did
for
no one
exactly
hoot it?
2 years before quietly
If I was
lapsing.
the car behind, if I could
The
drive a
same
car,
man Colleen
I would have
remembered,
hooted it.
the same man Lorelei described at
Nice
her door.
driving, mate.
Now we had a name,
Completely
a witness,
clueless. The guy's
and a
clueless,
pattern.
man.
What we needed next was Garrett's own voice.
Absolutely clueless.
I taped the recorder to the inside of my belt behind the buckle, tested it twice in the driveway, and drove to
And
my
he's
son's
completely
house in
unaware.
Blowing
He
Rock
wasn't
to let him think
doing
he
it
had
on
won.
purpose at all. He was just
Garrett's house
completely
sat at the
oblivious.
end of a private lane stone facade, a porch wider than
You
my
are
entire
currently
workship.
driving a car.
Simone Caldwell
How
opened the
about you
door
pay
before I
attention to
knocked.
what the fuck is in
She
front
was
of you?
42, sharp-featured,
Imagine.
the owner of a
Imagine
home
driving a
staging
car and
company
looking at the road
whose
in front
shell
of you.
corporation
That's fucking
had been the
nuts, right?
pipeline for every
What an
inflated
idea.
land transaction in those binders. She embraced me in the doorway, and her hand brushed my
surprised
waist
yourself
2
when
inches
you're
from the
sleeping, you
recorder.
Fucking hell.
"We are
I don't
so
think I've ever
glad you
woken
came,"
myself up
she
like
said.
that.
Garrett
I'm so
appeared
fine.
behind her.
I'm perfect.
My son, 45 years
I do
old,
not for-
a regional
for-
property
for-
development
push
consultant
pineapple,
who had spent
shake
7
the
years
tree.
administering his mother's trust
Na-
like a
na-
personal
na-
treasury.
na- na- na-
He shook
na-
my
na-
hand with both of his and led me to a dining
I do
table
not
set with
for-
white linen,
for-
good silver, and a bottle of wine that I was certain had been purchased with money from my own account. My son set the table the way you set a trap. Everything in its place,
Did I ever get a
the
puncture?
bait centered,
Don't jinx
the
it.
mechanism hidden beneath
Why
a
are you asking if I
tablecloth,
get a
and a
puncture?
meal I would have to force down to
jinxing
maintain
it.
the performance. Dinner was roasted lamb with rosemary. Garrett talked about the weather, about a development project in Hickory, about how the mountains looked this time of year. He waited until dessert to make his move. "Dad,
Drivers on their phones.
this has gotten out of hand," he said, setting a folder on the table. "Sterling Ashford is a good man, but he has filled your head with suspicions that don't hold up. Let's settle this as family." He opened the folder. 3 documents: a withdrawal of my emergency motion,
Probably
a new consent to sell the house, and an updated renunciation of trust rights. He set a pen on top and slid it across the linen toward me. "Sign these tonight, and I will have the motion dismissed by morning," he said. "No hearing, no publicity, just family taking care of family." I picked up the pen.
Yeah, there was loads of glass
Garrett's
on the road
shoulders
there.
dropped half an inch relief.
Hello, Betrayal.
He could not quite hide.
I am well.
Simone poured more wine. "I want you to understand what it takes to sit across from your own child,
Neighbor woke me up at 5:30.
watch him lie to your face, and write a name that is not yours while your heart beats so loud you are afraid the recorder will pick it up instead of his voice."
But I
I
don't
signed all 3 documents.
say anything bad to him.
But I signed them, Vern Bear
I don't
Caldwell.
say anything to him because
The
I
nickname
know
Constance
from previous
gave me
experience,
40 years
if
ago
I
on our
start
honeymoon.
having, like, animosity
A
or,
name
like,
that appears on
bad
no
blood with
birth
my neighbor,
certificate,
it's just gonna be
no
miserable.
driver's license,
So I just fucking
no legal record anywhere.
I just don't say anything.
Every signature was worthless, and Garrett did not notice.
I just give him the benefit
Are you
of the
still
doubt
with
and
me?
Carry on with my life.
Because this is where everything turns. Comment your guess in 1 sentence. What do you think happens next? A quick
Okay,
note.
P. Bears.
The next part includes some
You don't have
fictionalized
neighbors, damn, you live
details
in a
added to
detached
deepen
house
the
or
emotional
something,
impact.
fucking hell. Can you
What
give me some of
matters
that
is the
money?
lesson behind it. He
You wanna-
gathered the
you
pages
wanna
and smiled.
Send me some.
The relief in his face was total, and in that relief, he made the mistake I had driven 20 miles to
I'm
hear.
not burned out. No.
Thank you,
I feel better today, actually.
Dad.
I'm gonna push through the burnout.
This is the
Don't
right
worry.
decision.
Feel burnt out?
I know there was a
Fucking
problem
carry
with the
on.
notary
Keep going,
paperwork
bitch.
that was a mistake, and I have already taken steps to fix it. The recorder pressed against my hip bone. I kept my voice even. "What kind of problem with the notary?"
Tits? What do you mean?
"Just
tits?
an
That's a
administrative
random
thing," he said.
thing to say.
"The wrong name on the seal. It has been corrected." I pushed back my chair.
Sodom.
"Thank you for dinner,
Yeah,
son.
I mean,
Your mother would have wanted us to handle this as family."
whatever.
I walked to
It
the
is what
front
it
door
is.
without looking
It's like
back.
the first time he's woken me up. so I'm
Simone
not
called
gonna, like-
something pleasant
If
after
he did
me.
it all the time, I'd probably have to.
I did not
say
hear it over the
something.
blood in my
Yeah.
ears.
It's
I
first
sat in
of-
the car at the end of the driveway
time
with
in
the
a long
engine
time.
running and my hands shaking on the steering
Is
wheel.
what it is.
The recorder was still
Two
going.
berries and thank you for the
I reached
14
under my
bits.
belt, pressed stop,
Biddies
and
for the
played back
titties.
the last 30 seconds. Garrett's voice came through the
You
tiny
live in a semi-D,
speaker,
but your
clear
neighbour's
as a church
away
bell.
95% of the time. Fuck, you're lucky.
I know there was a problem
That is
with the
lucky, but
notary
then again,
paperwork. I had him.
The next person
And
who
he did
moves
not
in could
know
be
it yet.
an issue.
The night
Yeah,
air still smelled
I don't
like
wanna go
Garrett's
straight
driveway
there.
when
I
I
don't wanna go
drove
to
straight to
Wapping, man.
Sterling's office and set the recorder
I really
on his
do not
desk.
wanna go to Wapping.
He plugged it into his desktop
Where are we
speakers
going, actually?
and played the recording 3 times before he said a word. The word he said
we're
was
turning
not
left,
the
yeah.
one I wanted to hear.
If we turn
"It's
right, we go
helpful,"
to Tower Bridge.
he
I don't wanna
said,
go to Tower
"but it's
Bridge.
not conclusive." He rewound to the key phrase
Hey,
and
what?
played it again. Garrett's voice filled the small office above the pharmacy. Tinny through the speakers, but
Yeah, that's the
clear
thing
enough
with
to
neighbours is
transcribe.
It's better the devil
"I
you
know
than
there was a
neighbours
problem
are,
with the
because
notary paperwork. That
you
was a
could dislike
mistake,
a neighbor for whatever reason,
and
then
I
they
have
move and you
already
get
taken
someone
steps
worse.
to fix it."
So it's like
Sterling wrote the words down longhand on a
it's better
legal
to just keep
pad,
the peace, I think,
underlining
when it comes to
problem
neighbours.
and mistake
Well,
and
just
fix
everyone
it.
in general, just keep the peace.
Then he set the pen down.
Better to just keep the peace.
He
in
said he
general.
knew about a problem. He did not say he caused it. A competent defense attorney will argue Garrett discovered the notary error after the fact and was trying to resolve it quietly as a responsible administrator.
I mean, we
Not
were
as the
kind of
person
going in
who
this
ordered the
direction
forgery.
yesterday. I
He had
really don't wanna
documents
end up
ready
in
for me to
fucking Canary
sign,
Wharf
I
again.
said. He staged the
Fuck off.
entire dinner to pressure me into giving up my rights.
Bag of shit.
That proves coercion. It does not
Hold
prove
up by
he
the
hired
private
someone to
security for
forge the
literally just
original
sitting down.
seal 7 years
It's
ago.
nuts, man.
Sterling
I know
tapped
I'm
the
streaming,
transcript.
but like,
We have a strong case. The dead notary. The staged roof damage.
Anonymous,
the
thank you
siphoned
for the
funds.
gift to Cream
Colleen's
Pie
testimony.
Gargle.
The fake email account. And now this
Cream
recording.
Pie Gargle.
But we do not have the thread
Thank
that
you,
ties
Anonymous.
Garrett to the forgery from the beginning. We need
How about
proof of
Greenwich?
intent that he planned this before your wife died. I had
been to
walked into
Greenwich
my
recently-ish.
son's house wearing a recorder like a man in a crime film. And
Also,
I
the
had
thing
walked out with a
is,
confession that proved everything
where do you
except
go
the one
from
thing
Greenwich?
that mattered
Like,
most,
this is
that
the
he had
problem I
meant
always
to
have
do
when I
it
go to
all
Greenwich
along.
is
The
either I've
recording
gotta
showed
keep
a man
going
who knew.
east to get the Woolwich ferry.
It did not show a man who
over
planned.
towards
And in a courtroom,
London
Sterling
City
said that
Airport.
gap was wide enough for
Or
Garrett's attorney to drive a truck through. We spent the next
I
hour
have to go back
organizing
along the
what we
Thames back
had.
into central London.
Sterling spread the evidence across
know
his
what the fuck is
desk in
south of
chronological
I don't
order.
think I've
The
ever been
forged
south of Greenwich.
renunciation,
I
the
probably
dead
have, but I don't
notary's
know.
surrendered
I don't remember.
license, the staged roof photographs,
I'm gonna turn left.
Simone's tire
Can I?
tracks,
Yeah. I'm gonna just
the
do it.
inflated land transactions, the fraudulent capacity assessment, Colleen's email naming Paxton Riddle, the intercepted letters Lorelei had saved, and the dinner recording.
That gift sum must be
It was a
yours.
wall of
Who
proof.
knows? Anonymous is anonymous.
But it was a wall with a hole
You'll
in
never
it.
know.
And the hole was shaped like a single question. When did Garrett first decide to
How
do
you
this?
find these users?
Sterling's phone rang at
You can't be creating
11:15.
them, can you?
He glanced at the screen and answered immediately.
Hang on.
I watched his face change.
Damn, this white bite's still here.
The careful composure he had
Critical
maintained
mass
all
unit
week
and everyone's
tightened
up here.
into something I had not seen before. Urgency sharpened to a point.
I tell you,
The hearing has been moved to 2 o'clock today, he said, hanging up.
Rip.
The judge consolidated both motions, our emergency stay and Garrett's incompetency claim. We have 4 hours. 4 hours. I'd spent nearly a decade not knowing what my son had done, and now I had 4 hours to prove he had planned it before his mother was in the ground. We can win the emergency stay with what we have, Sterling said. He was already stacking files. The evidence of financial misconduct is overwhelming. But the incompetency counter motion complicates things, and without proof of premeditation, Garrett walks away as a negligent administrator, not a criminal conspirator. He keeps his license, his reputation, and his freedom. What do we need? Something that predates the forgery. Something that shows Garrett was already positioning himself before Constance died. He stopped stacking and looked at me. Vern and Lorelei said Constance may have written something down in those last days. She said the notebooks would be in your attic. You have not been up there yet. I had not. In all that time, I had not opened the cedar chest where Constance kept her papers. I had not climbed those stairs since the week after the funeral, when I closed the attic door and told myself there was nothing up there needed. I needed it now. I drove home faster than I should have and stood at the bottom of the attic stairs looking up into the dark. Constance had kept everything: letters, ledgers, notebooks, the careful paper trail of a woman who trusted documentation more than memory. If she had written about Garrett's plans in those final days, it was up there, sealed in the cedar chest with everything else she had tried to protect. I had 3.5 hours. I reached up, pulled the cord, and the light came on. I walked into the courtroom at 1:47 that afternoon, with attic dust still on my shirt and a leather notebook in my jacket pocket that smelled like Constance's perfume. I had found it 90 minutes earlier, buried in the cedar chest under 40 years of tax records. And I had read enough to know that my wife had seen everything coming. But that was not for today. Today was about stopping the bleeding. The notebook would come later. The Caldwell County Courthouse smelled like cleaning solution and old wood. Judge Marion Holt sat behind the bench, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, who watched Sterling approach the lectern the way a surgeon watches the first incision, across the aisle. Garrett sat in a pressed navy suit beside his attorney. He did not look at me. His jaw was set so tight I could see the muscles working from 12 feet away. Sterling began. He laid out the evidence the way he built legal arguments brick by brick, each one load-bearing. The forged renunciation stamped with a dead man's seal. The staged roof damage with tool marks photographed in daylight. The shell company funneling trust assets through inflated property deals. The fraudulent capacity assessment signed by a financial planner whose office sat on Garrett's own street. Colleen Ramsey's written statement describing her termination for flagging the notary discrepancy. And the dinner recording. I sat 12 feet from my son in a courtroom while a stranger read aloud the evidence of what he had done to me. This is not how a father is supposed to learn who his child has become. Not in front of a judge, not under fluorescent lights, not with a court reporter
There's no
typing
way
every
banks on
word.
number plates.
Garrett's attorney
Surely.
objected to the recording. The judge overruled him. Garrett's attorney objected to Colleen's statement as hearsay. The judge admitted it as a sworn declaration. Garrett's attorney challenged the roof photographs as inconclusive. The judge studied them for 30 seconds and said, "These tool marks are consistent with deliberate damage. I'll hear the rest."
So sad when that
Sterling
happens.
played the recording last. Garrett's voice filled the courtroom small through the
I hate to say
speakers,
it,
but
I wondered what
unmistakable.
happened. 'Cause that
I
kind
know
of-
there
that-
was a problem with the notary paperwork, that was a
corner there where
mistake,
that ghost flag was,
and I have already
I just
taken
can't
steps
imagine
to fix it.
how that
Garrett
happened
did
at
not
that point.
move.
Unless
His
a
attorney
massive bus
whispered
came around the
something.
corner and the cyclist
Garrett
was, like,
shook
in
his
the
head
middle of the
once.
road.
The judge
just
took
can't imagine how
15
it
minutes. She reviewed her
reverse
notes,
here, you bellend.
re-examined
What are you
2
doing?
exhibits, and asked Sterling one clarifying
Fucking
question
hell.
about the capacity assessment.
Why are people so
Then she
stupid?
ruled from the bench.
People are so
The
shit.
petition to sell the property at issue is suspended indefinitely, she said. The respondent's authority as sole trust administrator is frozen effective immediately. An independent estate supervisor will be appointed within 5 business days to oversee all trust transactions pending a full evidentiary hearing. She turned a page. As to the counter-motion alleging diminished
Friday
capacity,
brains, yep.
the court
It's the hot
finds no
weather.
credible basis for this claim.
People have been.
It is
honestly,
dismissed.
on the roads, people are so much worse
Dismissed.
in the hot weather.
That single
Unbelievable.
word erased 2 years of a document that said I could not understand my own
but-
finances.
Hello, by
2
the way.
years of a lie filed in a binder and mislabeled in an archive. One word from a judge and the wall between me and my own life came down. I drank water from a paper cup and crushed it in my fist without meaning to. Sterling set his hand on my shoulder as the courtroom cleared. Across the aisle, Garrett
Is that
stood,
near Scrotum
buttoned
Bill?
his jacket, and walked out without looking back. But I heard him in the hallway. The fluorescent light made his face look older than 45. He was speaking to his attorney in a voice pitched low, but not low enough the kind of whisper that
Carl
wants to be
Pilkington.
overheard. "This isn't over,"
Hello, FaZe.
he said. "He doesn't have the full picture." His attorney pulled him by the elbow toward the stairwell before he could say more. But the words stayed in the corridor like smoke. He doesn't have the full picture. Not, the evidence is wrong or will appeal. The full picture as if there were layers I had not yet reached, rooms I had not yet opened. Sterling heard it too. We walked to the parking lot in silence, and when we reached my car, he finally asked,
I am full.
"What did you find in the attic?" I reached into
I
my
am full
jacket and pulled out the leather
fire.
notebook. It was small, the kind Constance carried in her purse for decades. The kind she filled with lists and reminders and thoughts she wanted
Thank
to
you,
keep.
FaZe.
This one was
Battersea
different.
Park and Greenwich Park.
The
Why?
entries were dated. The last one was written 4
Why
days before she
particularly those
died.
two parks?
She knew everything.
Greenwich Park. That's
Sterling,
nowhere near
I
Battersea
said.
Park.
She knew about
What the hell?
Garrett, about the land, about the paralegal,
What the hell?
and she wrote down something else,
Brick Lane on the
something
right.
I have
know.
not told you yet.
I
Constance's
know.
handwriting was
We go there all
small
the
and
time.
precise, and reading it felt like sitting beside her again, except this
Get
time
my bagels,
she was
didn't
angry.
I go
Sterling and
there,
I
get
sat
me
in his office
bagels.
that evening with the leather notebook
Sometimes I
open
get me
between
coffee
us,
beans as well,
and my wife's
and
voice
these
came
those
through
things.
every line.
But I've got so
The
much
entries
fucking coffee beans
began
at
in
home, I
early
need to
March
not be buying
2017,
coffee
the
beans.
last week of her life.
Why am I going back to
She had
Central? 'Cause
noticed
I don't want to go
things.
east. I just
Garrett visiting the
feel like
house when
going
I was
east.
out.
We
A
went east
surveyor's
yesterday to
truck
Canary
parked
Wharf.
near
It's
the
just
old
like,
factory
all
land.
there is if you go east is
Phone
either
calls Garrett took
City
outside.
Airport,
Walking to the end of the driveway before
Stratford,
answering, Sterling
Canary
read aloud.
Wharf.
March
Let
5th,
me think, what
2017.
else is east?
Garrett brought a
I don't
young
feel like
man to
going
the
to any of
house
those
while
places.
Vernon was at the
I
hardware
gotta do
store.
what I feel like, right?
He had legal papers in
Otherwise,
a
I'll just
folder.
not wanna
I saw the
stream,
heading
so-
through the kitchen window. It said, "Renunciation of Beneficiary Rights." Sterling set the journal down and looked at me. "She saw it," I said. "She saw the document before it was ever forged, before I signed anything. This is premeditation." Vernon, dated and in her hand. This is what we needed proof that Garrett had the renunciation drafted while Constance was still alive. No defense attorney can call this an administrative error when the man's own mother documented him preparing the paperwork before there was any
Oh, thank you for the
paperwork
hype
to
train.
correct.
I missed
He turned
that,
the
thanks.
page.
Who bears it?
More entries,
hype
Constance
train
tracking
shot.
Garrett's movements. Noting the young man's second visit. Writing down a partial license plate from an unfamiliar car. And then the final entry, circled in blue ink. March 12, 2017.
To the cemetery.
I will tell Vernon on Tuesday. He needs to know what his son is planning. She died on March 14, a Tuesday. She died on the day she had chosen to tell me. And for all those years, that warning sat in a leather notebook in a cedar chest in my attic while my son emptied my life underneath it.
Actually, let's go
Constance
left, yeah.
had 4 days between seeing the
let's go
truth
left, yeah.
and reaching the end. And she spent those days writing it down, not for herself, not for a lawyer, but for me. She was building a record because she knew that someday I would need one. Sterling photographed every page and locked the journal in his office safe. We had premeditation now. We had a timeline that began before Constance died and extended through 7 years of forged documents, inflated transactions, and manufactured estrangement. The full hearing was 5 weeks away, and for the first time since Nadine had asked me how much I owned, I felt like we were ahead instead of behind. 2 days passed. The factory land deal deadline came and went without payment. The independent supervisor had frozen all trust disbursements, and without the trust's money, the transaction collapsed. By noon on day 12, word had spread through Lenore the way news travels in a furniture town. Everyone knows how things are built and how they come apart. By afternoon, everyone knew the Caldwell Trust was coming apart at the joints. Lorelei called that evening. Her voice was tight. "Dad, everyone at the college is talking about it. They remember Mom. They remember what the Hale family meant to this town." "The factory deal is dead," I told her. The supervisor froze everything. "Good." She paused, and I heard her take a breath. "But Dad, I have been thinking about the attic. The notebook you found Mom had more boxes up there, personal
I haven't
things,
seen a bridge opening for ages.
keepsakes.
There's
I
a
helped her
website you
carry
can
some
check.
of them up the year before she
I think
got
it's
sick.
called, if
What
you
kind
just
of
search for, like,
boxes?
how a bridge
I don't know
opening
exactly.
comes,
She packed them
there's like a
herself.
timetable.
She labeled them. The way she labeled everything.
Bridge openings,
Another
or something,
pause.
bridge liftings or something like that.
I never opened all of Mom's boxes. I couldn't. But there might be more up there.
I mean, if you got better things
Letters,
to do, then
documents,
don't worry.
things she
But
was
if you have
gathering.
not got better things to
We
do,
need to look together.
One of you could look
She
it up
arrived that afternoon.
and tell
We
me.
climbed the attic stairs side by side, and the light through the small window caught the dust we stirred with every step. The cedar chest where I had found the journal stood open from my first search, its lid propped against the wall. But Lorelei walked past it, past the stacked tax
I'm
files
gonna walk
and
over
the
the
garment
bridge today.
bag of Constance's winter coats, to the far corner where the roof line sloped low. She knelt and pushed the garment bag aside. Behind it, wedged against the wall where the eaves met the floor, sat a sealed cardboard box. Constance's
7:45.
handwriting
Oh,
covered the
thanks,
top
Robert.
in
That's
block
ages away.
capitals I would
I'm
have
not gonna be able to
recognized
see that.
anywhere.
Oh, wow.
For Vernon,
Maybe next
when the
week.
time comes. The packing tape was yellowed and brittle but
They're
unbroken.
reopening Hammersmith Bridge.
No
for
one had
cars,
opened it
really?
in all that time.
Why are they doing that?
Constance had sealed it, labeled it, hidden it behind her own coats, and waited for me to find it when I was ready. Lorelei looked at me. I looked at the box. The
I wonder
time
why
had
they're
come.
doing that.
We carried the box down from the
No,
attic and
bridge
set it on the
openings until
kitchen table.
7:45 is too late.
Lorelei's hands were shaking when she broke the yellowed tape, and mine were no steadier. We were about to hear from Constance one last time. Inside the cardboard was a cedar keepsake chest,
Come on, England.
the
That's
small
too late
kind
for that.
Constance used
They're
for
out.
things she wanted protected
They're out
from
of the World
moisture
Cup.
and time. Lorelei lifted the lid, and the smell
No
hit
more
us
football
both at
for
once.
us.
Cedar
Never
and
coming home, is
lavender,
it?
the sachet Constance
just gotta
tucked into
accept it's never
everything she
coming.
stored. It smelled like her closet. It smelled like her. 3 items inside. A leather journal, smaller than the one I had already found, with flagged pages marked by paperclips. A manila envelope
France
thick
v
with
England. Yeah, but
photocopied
who
documents,
That's
each
like a
one
friendly-
annotated
does
in
anyone
Constance's
actually care about
hand,
that? Why
and
would-
a
why would
sealed
you care
letter,
about that?
a white envelope with my name written across the front in her steadiest capitals. She packed this the way she packed everything, Lorelei said quietly. Labeled, organized, ready.
You said that hotel
She
on
lifted the
left.
journal
Damn,
and opened
must
it to
have
the
been
first
expensive.
flagged page.
We bottled it.
Dad,
That's
look
all
at the
a fucking
dates.
joke, innit?
March 8, March 10, March 13, every other day. She was building a record. My wife had been dead for 7 years, and she was still protecting me. She had packed this chest, knowing I would not find it until I needed it, and knowing that when I did, the dates and names inside would matter more than grief. Constance had always been the careful one. She documented everything. She trusted paper more than promises. Lorelei read the March 8 entry first. Constance had noted Garrett visiting the house twice that week while I was out, each time with folders she was not allowed to see. She had written down the license plate of an unfamiliar car in the driveway, a detail that matched the partial plate from the first journal. Then Lorelei turned to March 10. Her voice dropped. March 10. Garrett was on the phone in the kitchen. He said Harold's name, and then he said, "The seal is still registered." Harold died in January. Why is Garrett talking about his seal in March? Harold Emery, the notary whose name appeared on the forged renunciation. Constance had written his name 2 days before she died. 2 months after he died, and 7 years before Sterling and I found the proof. She had been ahead of all of us, even Garrett. Lorelei gripped my arm. She turned to the last entry, March 13, and read it aloud with a voice that kept cracking on the consonants. Harold Emery died on January 14. If his notary seal appears on any document dated after that day, someone used a dead man's credentials deliberately. I wrote the 2 witness clause into the trust for exactly this reason. Garrett knows Harold is dead. If he uses the seal, he chose a dead man on purpose.
Spain.
The kitchen was silent.
Are you hoping it's Spain, or you actually
Dust from the attic still floated in the afternoon light. Lorelei set the journal down and pressed both hands flat on the table. "Mom knew," she whispered.
The dirty.
She knew before she died.
Dirty.
Constance had seen Garrett circling the truss the way a carpenter sees a joint about to fail, the stress lines invisible to everyone else. The fracture coming before the break. She had recognized the pattern because she had built the trust herself. She had written its clauses and safeguards, and she knew which ones her son would try to circumvent. The 2 witness clause.
It is what it is.
She had put it there, not as boilerplate, but as a trap. A tripwire that would catch anyone who tried to forge a renunciation without 2 living witnesses present. And she had documented in dated entries the evidence that Garrett was already planning to step over it. I picked up the sealed letter last. The envelope was thick, the flap glued shut with the careful pressure Constance applied to everything she wanted to stay closed until it was time. I opened it with my thumbnail and unfolded a single page.
England played dirty.
Her handwriting filled the sheet steady, unhurried. Written by a woman who knew she was running out of days and chose to spend them on this. The first line read, "Vernon, if you are reading this, then I was right about Garrett. And I am sorry I was not alive to tell you myself." I read it twice. Lorelei read it over my shoulder. Neither of us spoke. The last line read, "Look at what he did with the factory land. That is where the money went, and that is where you will find what he cannot explain." Constance had not just left me a warning.
Anyway,
She had left me a map, and the map pointed to the same piece of ground where her father had poured a concrete foundation 60 years ago, the land Garrett had bought back with my money, and sold through his wife's company at twice its worth. Sterling and I spent the next day tracing the factory land transactions Constance's letter pointed to, and what we found confirmed every word she had written. Still, I could not stop turning Garrett's words over in my mind. He doesn't have the full picture. What picture? What was left that I had not already seen? Every hour that passed without an answer made the question sit heavier in my chest. But the proof we still needed Garrett's own intent in his own hand arrived that evening from the last person I expected. Headlights swept across my front yard at 9 o'clock. I opened the door expecting Sterling or Lorelei. It was neither. Simone Caldwell stood on my porch in a dark coat. No makeup, no composure, holding a flash drive in her right hand like a woman offering a grenade with the pin already pulled. Garrett's attorney told us yesterday that a criminal referral is likely, she said. She did not step inside.
We could just play pretend.
She did not ask to. I am not going to prison for my husband's plan. She talked for 20 minutes on my porch, while the night air carried the smell of pine and damp earth. And something was deeply wrong about hearing my daughter-in-law's perfume in a place she had never stood before. She told me everything. The roof. Her brother had done it. She paid him $3,000 to pry the shingles loose along the south slope and photograph the result with the same drone she used for her staging business. She photographed it herself the next morning, framing the angles to look like years of neglect instead of one night of vandalism. The notary seal. Garrett found Paxton Riddle 4 months before Constance died, a freelance paralegal out of Hickory who had access to notary equipment and did not ask questions. Garrett paid him $12,000 to replicate Harold Emery's seal after Harold died. $12,000. That is what it cost my son to buy a dead man's credentials and erase my signature from my own life. $12,000 out of a trust worth millions, pocket change to pay for my disappearance. He chose Harold because Harold had notarized the original trust documents. The seal would look authentic to anyone who did not check the dates. And for all that time, nobody checked. We all knew Harold was dead, Simone said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed, as if she had practiced this speech in the car on the way over. Garrett chose him on purpose. A dead notary cannot be questioned. She reached into her coat pocket and held out the flash drive. Emails between Garrett and Paxton Riddle. Invoices from my company to the trust. The arrangement with Hugh Bartlett for the capacity assessment. She paused. Bartlett is Garrett's neighbor in Blowing Rock. He is a financial planner, not a physician. He signed the assessment in his own living room. You were never in the room. You were never told it existed. She stood on my porch in the dark and told me everything my son had done. The worst part was not the confession. It was that she had kept copies. She had always known this day would come. She had saved every email, every invoice, every document, not out of guilt, but out of strategy. Simone had positioned herself to survive the collapse she always saw coming. Why did you keep all of it? I asked. Because I married a man who plans for himself, she said. I learned from him. She stepped back off the porch. The last thing she said stayed with me longer than anything else. He said you would never read the fine print. He was right for 7 years. But I am not going to prison because my husband thought his father was stupid. I watched her taillights disappear down the road. The flash drive sat in my palm, lighter than it should have been for what it carried. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and plugged it into my laptop. The first folder contained 37 emails. The second contained scanned invoices. The third contained the Bartlett assessment and a photograph of Garrett standing with Paxton Riddle outside the trust company, dated, time-stamped. Taken from a security camera Simone must have pulled from the building's system. I opened the earliest email. It was from Garrett to Paxton Riddle, dated February 2017, 1 month before Constance died. The subject line was blank. The body was 3 sentences. Harold's seal is still registered. Once mother passes, we move on the renunciation within 10 days. Do not contact the family directly. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. The words did not change. Once mother passes. He had not written if. He had written once. The word of a man who was waiting, who had already decided, who had mapped the sequence of events that would follow his own mother's death and assigned a timeline to each step. He had been waiting for Constance to die. And the moment she did, he moved. I brought the flash drive to Sterling the next morning. He read the February 2017 email 3 times, closed his laptop, and said 2 words. We have him. 6 weeks later. Every seat in the Caldwell County courtroom was filled, and my son sat 12 feet away in a suit I had paid for with money he stole from me. Sterling presented the case the way he built everything, in sequence, each piece bearing the weight of the next. Nadine took the stand first and walked the court through the trust's transaction history.
Because also that would
She
mean
spoke
that
in
I
the
could
same measured tone she had used in her
stream
office,
for
reading
another
figures that turned a crowded
9 months or
courtroom
so.
silent. The inflated land purchases, the management fees, the shell company. She did not editorialize. The numbers did that themselves. Colleen testified next. She sat straight-backed on the witness stand and told the court what she had told us in the cafe. The flagged commission number,
Costs more to treat
the
it,
compliance
really.
report,
I think it'll be all
the
right.
Friday
I wouldn't put
termination.
my head under.
Her voice did not
I'd
waver.
just do show up to the
I
neck.
flagged the notary commission
just
number
dunk
in
in and get out.
2017, she said. 2 weeks later, I was
Hello, crew, man.
terminated. The document I questioned is the same one before this court today. A handwriting expert confirmed the forged signature. Then Simone took the stand. She had been granted limited immunity in exchange for her testimony, and she used it completely. She described the staged roof her brother Matt, the pry bar, the drone photographs she took herself. She described Paxton Riddle replicating the dead notary's seal on equipment Garrett purchased. She described the capacity
it's just a
assessment
typo.
arranged through Hugh Bartlett,
You don't have to-
Garrett's neighbor, who
you don't have
signed
to
it
do
in his
anything to
living
your
room
keyboard.
without ever meeting me.
I wouldn't
Let me
do
tell
that
you
to
what
your
it
keyboard
sounds
if I
like
were
to
you.
hear your own son's voice played
It
through
might make the
courtroom
keys
speakers.
sticky.
His
Sticky
casual
keys.
dinner admission amplified
wants sticky
and
keyboard
echoing off
keys.
wood-paneled walls, while the judge takes notes
Do they?
and your daughter grips your hand so hard her knuckles go white. It sounds ordinary. That is the worst part. Garrett's voice on the recording was relaxed, conversational. The voice of a man who believed the
Just wait for it to
problem
dry
was
off and then
already
turn it
solved.
upside down and hit it.
The courtroom
And
heard a
it'll
man
come out like
confessing,
dandruff.
without knowing he was being heard.
Won't it?
Sterling read Constance's journal entry aloud. The cedar scent from the leather binding carried faintly even from the exhibit table. Her words filled the room the
Like
way her
dandruff.
voice once had. Careful, precise, final.
Like dandruff.
Then Sterling projected the email from the flash drive. February 2017. Garrett's own words
like
to
a fruity
Paxton
drink
Riddle,
now.
written 1 month before his mother
Something
died.
nice and quenching.
The courtroom read it in silence. I watched Garrett read it too,
Quench
and for
these
the first time since this began, I saw something move behind his composure. Not guilt, not shame, but the recognition that the wall he had built was now on the other side of him. Garrett's attorney tried to reframe. Misguided caretaking, a son overwhelmed by responsibility, administrative decisions made in good faith that spiraled beyond intention. The judge listened without expression.
Quench these,
Then she looked
fuck,
at
shall I
Garrett
just cycle to
directly.
Greenwich?
Mr.
We
Caldwell,
could go to Greenwich, to be honest.
your attorney has
Rather than
characterized
Thames Park,
these actions as administrative
Greenwich?
oversights.
Someone
Do you
mentioned
wish to
Greenwich, I
maintain
think,
that
what?
position under oath?
Shall we go to Greenwich?
Garrett's attorney reached for
Do we
his
have a
arm.
poll?
Garrett stood
Greenwich
anyway.
or Central?
No, Your Honor. His voice cracked on the second word, and for a moment, the courtroom held its
no.
breath. I knew.
Road to Croydon.
I knew
Oh,
about the
never-
notary. I knew the signature was
Road
not
to
his.
Croydon. Why?
I knew the
Why
land
do you
deals
not
went
Croydon
through
so
Simone's company at above market value. He turned and
Might as
looked
well
at
go to
me,
Woolwich.
not at the
The ferry.
judge,
I haven't
not
taken
at
the ferry for a
Sterling.
while, to be honest.
at me.
Never
He
did
said he
end up
loved
in
me.
London
He
City
looked me in the
Airport,
eye
American.
and said the word love in the same sentence as
Not Central,
I
you go
didn't
every
trust
day,
him,
that's true.
as if those two things could live in the same room without one of them being a lie. Everything I did because I loved him, Garrett said.
True.
I didn't trust him to manage what my mother built.
Don't audit
I thought I was
Singapore
protecting the
again.
family. The courtroom was silent. Lorelei's hand tightened on mine until I could feel her pulse through her
Superhands
fingers.
is a fictional character.
I did not look away from my son. He had called theft love and control protection. And he believed that was the part that cut deepest. He was not lying, he was worse than lying. He was telling himself a story that made the villain the hero. And he had been telling it so long, he could not hear how it sounded to anyone else. Judge Marion Holt looked at Garrett for a long time. Then she looked at me. Mr. Caldwell, she said. And for a moment I did not know which of
He's
us
run
she
from
meant.
Windsor to Croydon, I remember that
The
episode.
court will render its
wearing
decision
a
tomorrow
suited
morning
woolly
at
scarf.
9 o'clock. Both parties will be
I watched
present.
that TV show
She
too
struck
much.
the gavel once.
Hey, GPU.
The sound echoed off every wall in the room. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the light over the stove and Constance's journal on the table, and waited for morning the way you wait for surgery, knowing it will fix you something, knowing it will hurt. When I walked into the courtroom at 8:45, my son was already seated, and for the first time in my life, he looked old. His suit was the same navy he had worn the day before, but his face had changed overnight, the jaw less certain, the eyes focused on a point somewhere past the judge's bench, as if he were already looking at a place he did not want to go. Judge Marion Holt entered at 9 exactly. She carried a typed decision and did not look up until she was seated. Then she began to read. The renunciation document filed in 2017 is voided in its entirety as a fraudulent instrument, she said. The respondent is permanently removed from all roles within the Constance Caldwell Family Trust and is barred from fiduciary service in this jurisdiction. She turned a page. Full restitution of all diverted funds is ordered. This court further refers the matter to the Caldwell County District Attorney for criminal prosecution on charges including forgery, fraud, and financial exploitation of an elder. Criminal prosecution. The words landed in the courtroom the way a door lands when it closes for the last time, heavy, final, echoing. Garrett did not move. His attorney wrote something on a pad. Sterling set his hand on my shoulder and squeezed once. $5 million. That was the number the judge cited for restitution. But the number I heard was 7.
I'll just see what
7 years my son spent dismantling everything his mother built to protect me. One transaction at a time, while I ate dinner at his table, and thanked him for looking after me. 7 years of forged seals and inflated land deals, and a capacity assessment signed in a neighbor's living room. 7 years of telling me my daughter did not want me. The money could be returned. The years could not. The judge looked at me. Mr. Caldwell, the court recognizes that this proceeding has required extraordinary courage. Your trust is restored to you. What your family does with that restoration is not for this court to decide. She closed the file. The courtroom began to stir, attorneys gathering papers, the gallery shifting.
There's no one here.
I stood and walked toward the doors. Sterling walked beside me. Lorelei was somewhere behind us. And then a hand grabbed my arm. Garrett stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. His composure was gone. His eyes were red. His attorney was 3 steps behind, reaching for him, but Garrett had already closed the distance. Dad, please. His voice was raw. Don't cooperate with the prosecutors. I can't go to prison. Think about Beckett. Think about what this does to the family. What do you say to your child when he stands in a courthouse hallway and begs you to help him escape the consequences of stealing your life? What is the word for the love that says no to? I looked at my son. I saw Constance in his chin and my father in his hands. And I saw a 45-year-old man who had spent the better part of a decade convincing himself that theft was stewardship and control was care. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to protect him from what he had done. And that was the one thing I could not do without becoming part of the lie. You stole from me for 7 years, I said. You forged my name. You cut me off from my daughter. You used a dead man's seal, and you waited for your mother to die before you started. I kept my voice level, because if I raised it, I would not be able to stop. I will not lie for you, Garrett. I will not shield you. I pulled my arm free. The last physical contact between my son and me for what I already knew would be a very long time. But I am not the one who decides your sentence, I said. That belongs to you, not me. You built it. You carry it. I turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. The May air hit my face like water rain and green things and fresh-cut grass. The smell of a season I almost did not live to see as a free man. Behind me, I heard Garrett's attorney say, "We need to talk about the criminal timeline." And Garrett's voice, "How long?" The attorney said. 48 months is the guideline. I kept walking. Lorelei was waiting at the car. The summer passed the way summers do, when everything is changed slowly and full of things I did not expect to feel. Garrett received his 48 months in September, after fighting the charges through the hottest weeks of the year, until digital forensics recovered what he thought he had deleted draft versions of the forged renunciation. Saved on his own laptop, dated before Constance died. He pled guilty on a Monday. Sterling called me that afternoon. 48 months. State facility, he said. He asked if you were there. I told him you were fixing your roof. I was. I had been up on the back slope since dawn, replacing every shingle that had been pried loose to prove I was too old to care for my own house. Each nail was an answer to a question no one had the right to ask. The trust could have paid a contractor. Lorelei told me so, twice. Standing in the yard with lemonade she had mixed, too sweet, shielding her eyes against the sun.
Hey, Fedor.
You don't have to do this yourself. Dad. I know. But this roof is mine. I'm going to fix it the way I built it. Simone had pled guilty in June, fraud and evidence tampering, and received 18 months with early release for her cooperation.
I don't know if I can,
Paxton Riddle pled guilty to forgery in July and received 24 months. Hugh Bartlett surrendered his financial planning license in August and paid a civil penalty for the fraudulent capacity assessment his cooperation kept him out of criminal court, but not out of the public record. The dominoes fell in the order Sterling predicted, one by one, each plea confirming the next, until the full architecture of what Garrett had built was visible to anyone who looked. By autumn, the criminal cases were closed. The restitution process was underway, and the Constance Caldwell Family Trust had a new administrator, Lorelei. I appointed her myself. She drove up from Hudson every Wednesday to review the accounts with the independent supervisor. And on weekends, she brought Beckett. He would climb the ladder and hand me nails from the bucket one at a time, with the seriousness of a surgeon passing instruments. Grandpa, when we finish the roof, can you teach me how to build a birdhouse? I can teach you how to build anything. I replaced every shingle on that south slope by hand. I repaired the water damage in the ceiling. I sanded and restained the porch boards where the rain had pooled. The house that Garrett had tried to sell out from under me became board by board. More mine than it had been in years. Constance would have approved. She always said, a house only belongs to you if you are willing to do the work nobody else wants to do. The letter arrived in January. It came in a plain white envelope with a state facility return address and my name written in a handwriting that looked like mine. That was the first thing I noticed. Garrett had inherited my hand, the same way Lorelei had inherited Constance's voice. Even in a prison letter, I could see myself in my son. 3 pages. Handwritten on lined paper. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask me to intervene or write to the parole board or send money. He wrote about the first decision that led to the second, and the second to the third, and how by the time he understood what he had become, he had already built an entire life around the lie. I did not start by deciding to steal from you, he wrote. I started by deciding I knew better, and then each decision after that was easier than the one before, until I could not see the line I had crossed because I had been walking past it for years. He wrote about the years he had taken, not the money the years with Lorelei, the years with Beckett, the years I spent alone in this house because he made sure I had no one to call. I do not expect you to write back, the letter closed. I do not deserve that, but I needed you to know that I understand now what I took. I read it twice. I folded it along its creases and carried it to the living room. Constance's photograph sat on the mantel, the one from our anniversary, where she is laughing at something I said that I can no longer remember. I set the letter beside it and stood there for a long time, behind me, through the kitchen window. I could hear Beckett in the workshop, sanding something. Lorelei's car was in the driveway. The roof above my head was new and solid and mine. I did not know yet whether I would write back. But I did not throw the letter away. I wrote back. 1 page, 2 sentences. I received your letter. When you are ready to be honest about all of it, I will be here. I mailed it on a Tuesday because Constance would have. That's Saturday. Beckett held the sandpaper the wrong way the first 3 times, and on the 4th try he got it right. The look on his face was exactly the look Constance used to give me when something difficult finally made sense. A quiet satisfaction. Earned, not given. We were in the workshop behind the house, repairing the old oak chair Constance had used at her writing desk. A loose mortise and tenon joint, a cracked spindle, 40 years of weight and use settling into the wood the way time settles into everything. I guided Beckett's hand along the grain. With the grain, not against it, I said. You feel the difference. The wood tells you which way it wants to go. He nodded with the seriousness of a boy who believes he is doing important work. He right. Lorelei sat on the workbench beside us with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, ham, and mustard. The way Constance made them, watching her son learn what her father had taught her. I talked to Sterling yesterday, I said, fitting the spindle back into the seat. I've asked him to set up a legal aid fund, the Constance Caldwell Legal Aid Fund, a portion of the recovered trust money, earmarked for legal representation for elders facing financial exploitation. Lorelei set down her sandwich. In Mom's name, there are people like me out there who don't have a Sterling Ashford. Your mother would have found them herself. I will do it for her. I have built things my whole life. Cabinets, chairs, a marriage, a family. Some of them broke, the ones that mattered. I learned to rebuild, the ones I could not fix. I learned to carry. The fund would not undo what Garrett did, but it would take the wreckage and make it load-bearing. Turn stolen money into shelter for someone else. Beckett blew the sawdust off the repaired joint and ran his thumb along the seam the way I had shown him. Grandpa, why do you still drive your old truck if you're rich? Lorelei opened her mouth to correct him, but I shook my head. Because freedom isn't the money in the account, Beckett. It's having no one who can take your choices away. He thought about that for a moment, then picked up the sandpaper again. The sawdust smelled like the first day I ever walked into a workshop. Sweet and clean. The smell of something about to become something else. The rain started in the late afternoon. It came softly at first, tapping on the tin roof of the workshop like fingers on a table, then building until it drummed steadily and the gutters ran. We carried the repaired chair across the yard and through the back door, holding it between us like something fragile. Though the joints were tight and the glue was set, and the wood was stronger now than it had been in years, we set it at the kitchen table.
What's my new speaker called?
Constance's chair in Constance's place. If you are listening to this and you are 73 years old and someone is telling you that you cannot manage your own life, get a second opinion. Get a third, and then go up to your attic. Because the people who loved you may have left something there you have not found yet. Beckett ran to the window and pressed his face against the glass. The rain was coming down hard now, sheeting off the Iliard where the old leaks used to send water cascading down the siding. He turned to me. Grandpa, it's really coming down. Is the roof going to be okay? The roof is going to be just fine. I stood in the hallway and listened. Lorelei stood beside me, her shoulder against mine, and neither of us spoke. The rain hammered the shingles I had nailed one by one through the long summer, every one placed by hand. Every one, an answer to the lie that I was too old to care for my own house. And underneath them, silence. No dripping, no water stain spreading across the ceiling, no leak. Not a single drop. Lorelei said. Not a single drop. Constance's photograph was on the mantel. Garrett's letter leaned beside it. Beckett was at the window. Lorelei was in my kitchen. The chair was repaired. The fund was named. And the house was full of the people who stayed. The roof held. Everything Constance built, it held. And to you listening to my story,
Kick me off the bench. I got kicked
remember
off 3
this.
things week.
I spent 7 years
got
trusting
called
the
by a
wrong
robbery
person
club.
with everything I had.
Well,
My
actually, the guy at
home,
BBC
my
was quite
money,
nice to me.
my family.
Security guard at BBC
I let
was
someone
nice.
else hold the keys to my life because I thought love meant not asking questions. Do not make my mistake. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Ask. Verify. Read the fine print. And never let anyone, not even your own child, convince you that you are too old to understand your own affairs.
I tried to
This
do
was
that
not a
for you.
revenge story in the way most people imagine one. There were no dramatic speeches or last-second victories pulled from thin air. This was a slow, painful fight to take back what was mine and to find the family I thought I had lost along the way. The real revenge story is living well after someone tried to erase you. It is fixing the roof they broke, raising the grandchild they hid from you, and building a fund in your wife's name so that no one else has to fight alone the way you did. I believe God put me through this so I could be standing here today, telling you protect the people you love by paying attention, even when it hurts. If this revenge story meant something to
What's the
you,
old speaker again?
I would be
Fucking
grateful if
both
you
really
shared it
sound
with
like I
someone who
told you
needs to
already.
hear it, a parent,
Harland, are
a
you okay?
neighbor,
All you do is
a
ask
friend
like
who
these
might be going
fucking
through something similar
inane
and does not know where to
questions,
start.
okay? Are you okay?
Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in my place. And if you have not already,
Every day
please
you ask
subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means
Yeah,
more
okay,
than you
sorry.
know.
I do apologize.
Please remember, some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative and emotional impact. The core message that trust must be earned and verified, especially within family, is what I hope you carry with you.